After my son told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas, I got in my truck and drove away. 3 days went by before 40 missed calls stacked up on my phone. I am Vernon Kessler, 71 years old, and for 4 years I quietly covered the $4,200 monthly mortgage on the sprawling suburban property where my son Donovan and his wife Petra live. I kept myself in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat just to make sure I could keep that support going. But that Christmas Eve, standing on their freezing porch, I understood I was not a father to them. I was an automated clearinghouse. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer building municipal bridges across the state. I know exactly how much weight a foundation can hold before it cracks. I know the precise mathematical moment when a supporting beam will buckle under a sustained, unyielding load. Human relationships are not so different from bridges. They require maintenance balance and a mutual distribution of weight. For the last 4 years, I had been carrying the entire load for my son Donovan, and the foundation was beginning to scream. When my wife passed away 5 years ago, the silence inside our old family home became deafening. Welcome back to alphadadstories. I'm glad you found your way here today. If this is your first time, tap that subscribe button so the next story comes straight to you. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something simple when someone wrongs you. Do you tend to speak up right away, or do you wait and let the truth surface on its own? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. The empty hallways echoed with memories too heavy to carry on my own. Donovan had just married Petra, a woman whose ambitions far outpaced her earnings. They were stuck in a cramped rental, buried in wedding debt, and never tired of complaining about how little room they had. What they wanted was a house, not just any house, but a 4-bedroom craftsman in a gated subdivision, manicured lawns, neighborhood association, and all. They had no credit, no down payment, nothing but demands and expectations. I made the decision that grieving fathers sometimes make. I chose to purchase their happiness. I bought the property outright through a limited liability company I controlled, intending to protect the asset. I told Donovan and Petra I had co-signed a specialized mortgage on their behalf, and that I would cover the $4,200 monthly payment out of my retirement funds to help them find their footing. I framed it as temporary, a crutch to lean on until Donovan earned his promotion. To make that work without drawing down my investment portfolio, I sold the family home and moved into a tight, drafty one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. My mornings came with the hiss of industrial washers and the rumble of delivery trucks rolling past. My kitchen had room for little more than a single table. My wardrobe was faded canvas work shirts, worn corduroys, and steel-toed boots that had seen better decades. I lived like a man running on fumes. I did this deliberately. I wanted to find out whether the boy I raised would value my presence once I appeared to have nothing left to offer but my company. The answer came slowly, and it was agonizing. Donovan's calls turned strictly transactional. My phone would ring on a Tuesday afternoon, and my chest would lift for a moment. Maybe he was calling to ask about my week, or to suggest we grab coffee. Instead, the conversations were surgical and hollow. Dad Nolan needs private calculus tutoring this semester, and it's $800. Can you handle that? Dad Petra wants patio furniture before the neighborhood garden party. We need another $1,000. Dad, the property taxes are due. You're handling that right. No warmth. No question about the arthritis that flared whenever the winter damp crept through my apartment walls. Just invoices delivered in a familiar voice. I paid them. every single one. I was running a stress test on my own family, watching the load-bearing walls of our relationship warp and buckle under the weight of their entitlement. Petra was the worst of it. On the rare occasions I visited, always scheduled weeks out in advance, she treated my arrival like a routine maintenance inspection. She would eye my scuffed boots on her pristine hardwood floors with barely concealed disgust. She had a coaster in my hand before I'd even fully sat down. The breaking point didn't come with a shout or a slammed door. It arrived quietly on a freezing evening in late December. 6 o'clock Christmas Eve. The temperature had sunk to 14 degrees, and a bitter slicing wind was driving sleet sideways across the suburban streets. I had spent the entire week in my small apartment kitchen getting ready for that night. I had slow-roasted a spiral-cut, honey-glazed ham, basting it for hours until it was exactly right. More than that, I had spent the past 2 months in the corner of my living room I used as a workshop hand-carving a custom wooden race car set for my grandson Nolan. Every edge sanded, every piece painted by hand, the track assembled and ready to sprawl across a living room floor in a way I knew would light up his face. I wrapped everything carefully, loaded it all into my worn-out work truck, and drove 45 minutes across town through the worsening storm. The houses in Donovan's subdivision blazed with holiday lights. Laughter and warm music spilled from the neighbors' windows. I parked at the end of their long driveway, shivering, as I gathered the heavy ham and the large wrapped box holding the race car set. I walked up the salted path to their grand front door, could see the flicker of a fire through the frosted glass. I could hear the clink of wine glasses, the low murmur of polished conversation. I pressed the doorbell, breath clouding in the frozen air, fingers numb even inside my gloves. I waited. The music inside dropped in volume. Footsteps crossed toward the door. The heavy oak door swung open barely, just enough for Petra to fill the threshold. She had on a tailored velvet dress, a gold chain resting against her collarbone. A wave of warm, cinnamon-scented air rolled over my frozen face. Her eyes traveled down to my faded canvas jacket, my snow-caked boots, the aluminum foil stretched across the roasting pan in my hands. Her expression twisted into a sharp, panicked grimace. "Vernon, what are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests behind her couldn't hear. I smiled though the cold was gnawing at my face. "I brought the ham, Petra, and I have Nolan's gift. Thought I'd drop them tonight so they're ready for tomorrow." Petra didn't open this door any wider. She gripped the edge of the wood knuckles, going white. "Vernon, tonight is my corporate holiday mixer. The senior partners from my firm are in the living room. We're having a catered formal evening." Before I could absorb the complete absence of any invitation to step inside out of the sleet, Donovan materialized behind her. He rested a hand on his wife's shoulder and peered through the gap. He was in a tailored blazer, holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon, the bourbon I had bought him for his birthday. "Dad, what are you doing?" Donovan's tone carried the weight of heavy, impatient annoyance. "We talked about this. Tonight is for Petra's colleagues." I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose college tuition I had paid in full, the man whose roof stayed above his head because of my daily sacrifice. "I just came to drop off the food for tomorrow," I said quietly, "and to give Nolan his gift." Donovan let out a sharp, exasperated breath that the winter wind swallowed up. "Dad, you don't really fit the aesthetic we're going for tonight. My partners can't see you on the porch looking like a lumberjack. Just leave the food and the box on the mat. We'll bring it in once the caterers wrap up." I stared at him. Sleet was beginning to settle on my shoulders. I felt the roasting pan burning heat through the foil into my numb hands. Leave it on the mat. Like a delivery driver. Like hired help. "And about tomorrow?" Donovan went on, shifting his weight, but not moving the door a single inch. We've decided to keep it intimate, just the three of us. Petra is worn out from the firm, and we need our space. You're not invited to Christmas dinner either. Her parents are flying in, and it's going to be a tight house. We'll call you next week to catch up. The silence that dropped between us was heavier than the storm. I looked into my son's eyes. I searched for a flicker of shame, a twitch of conscience, some shadow of the boy who used to beg me to read him stories beside the fire. There was nothing, only the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had taken everything useful from a machine and was now switching it off for the holidays. You're not invited. We need our space. Leave it on the mat. In engineering, when a structure reaches its ultimate tensile strength, the failure is not gradual. It is catastrophic and instantaneous. The bonds snap, the supports shear, and the whole structure collapses into a pile of twisted wreckage. Standing on that porch, the illusion of my family suffered exactly that kind of failure. I didn't yell. I didn't demand to see my grandson. I didn't hurl the ham onto their immaculate porch. Rage is an uncontrolled release of energy. I am an engineer. I control energy. I redirect it. I looked at Donovan. I looked at Petra. I nodded slowly. I understand, I said. My voice was perfectly level, stripped clean of the fatherly warmth they had spent years drawing on. I bent down. I set the hand-carved wooden race car set on the freezing wet welcome mat. I placed the warm roasting pan right beside it. I straightened up and looked at my son one final time. Merry Christmas, Donovan. I turned my back on them and walked down the path. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the deadbolt turned before I was halfway to the truck. I climbed into the freezing cab. I didn't reach for the heater. I sat in the biting cold and let the physical discomfort hold my mind in place. The betrayal sat in my chest like a physical load, a suffocating pressure that demanded release but not through tears. I started the engine and pulled away from the glowing subdivision, working the slick, icy roads with mechanical precision. 3 miles out, the flickering fluorescent lights of a desolate gas station appeared through the snow. I turned into the empty lot and stopped beside the air pump. The snow was falling harder now, building a thick white layer across the windshield. The isolation was total. I reached into my pocket and drew out my smartphone. My fingers were stiff. My mind had never been sharper. I opened the banking application. The blue glow of the screen lit the dark cab. I moved past the modest checking account I used for groceries and scrolled down to the automated transfers section. There it was. The lifeline. The invisible cord that pumped my resources into their ungrateful lives. Scheduled transfer. $4,200. Recipient Donovan Kessler, mortgage escrow. Scheduled date, December 26th. For 4 years, that transfer had executed without a single failure. It was the structural foundation of their entire existence. It paid for the roof sheltering the catered party they were throwing. It paid for the doors they had just shut in my face. It was the money that let Petra wear velvet and gold while I went around in faded canvas. I stared at the screen. The cancel button sat at the bottom, outlined in red. I didn't fit their aesthetic. They needed their space. They had written me off as an outdated fixture, something to be left on the welcome mat in the freezing sleet. They believed they held all the leverage because they held my grandson and my affection hostage. They had forgotten one fundamental rule of structural mechanics. The entity that provides the support controls the collapse. I pressed my frozen thumb to the glass. I tapped the red button. A confirmation prompt appeared. Are you sure you want to permanently cancel this recurring transfer? Yes. The screen refreshed. The transfer was gone. The money stayed in my account. The cord was cut. I exhaled my breath, clouding the cold air of the cab. The tightness in my chest didn't dissolve, it crystallized. It hardened into something useful. I set the phone in the cup holder and shifted into gear. As I rolled out of the gas station and onto the dark highway, heading back to my cramped apartment, the silence inside the truck was abruptly shattered. The phone began to vibrate hard against the plastic console, the screen blazing with a name. Donovan. It was 6:45. He had likely just received the automated email alert from the bank about the canceled pending transaction. The bank's algorithms were merciless and immediate. The phone kept buzzing, a frantic, desperate rhythm across the console. I didn't reach for it. My hands stayed on the wheel, eyes locked on the snowy road ahead. I let it ring. I sat with the sound of his panic filling the small cabin. It stopped. A moment later, it started again, ringing, vibrating, demanding. I reached down and picked it up. I pressed the green button. I held the phone to my ear and said nothing. I simply listened to the cold, dead air on the line. Dad. Donovan's voice came through sharp and loud. He was no longer whispering. He had stepped away from the corporate mixer. The background was quiet, probably the garage away from his guests. Dad, are you there? Listen, I just got a weird automated alert from the bank. It says the escrow transfer for the 26th was canceled. You need to call their customer service line right now and sort out the tech glitch. The grace period ends on the 1st, and we cannot have a late fee hitting our credit report. Call them and fix it. He didn't ask whether I had made it home safely through the ice. He didn't offer a word of apology for leaving me on the porch. He issued a command to the machine he expected to keep dispensing money on schedule. I listened to his breathing through the speaker. I listened to the arrogant certainty that I was simply a malfunctioning piece of hardware in his perfect life. Dad, are you listening to me? Call the bank. I lowered the phone from my ear. I pressed the red button and cut the line. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and clicked on the radio, letting a late-night broadcast fill the cab with quiet static. The first domino had fallen. The foundation had been pulled. And as I drove back toward my small apartment above the laundromat, I knew with cold, absolute certainty that the audit of their entire lives was about to begin. The morning after Christmas was bitter, but I felt nothing as I pushed through the glass doors of Heritage Trust Bank. The holiday music drifting from the overhead speakers felt like a mockery of what I had come to dismantle. I hadn't come for comfort, or to replay the image of my son turning the deadbolt in my face in the freezing rain. I had come to inspect the blueprints of a collapsing structure. An engineer doesn't patch paint over a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall. You strip away the drywall and examine the whole foundation. I walked straight to the teller and asked for a meeting with the branch manager. The manager, a younger man named Gerald, recognized me on sight. I looked like nothing: faded denim, a plain wool coat, a man of no particular consequence. But Gerald knew the balances tied to the limited liability company accounts I kept in their vault. He brought me into his glass-walled office without hesitation. I asked him to pull every financial record connected to my Social Security number. I needed to confirm the cancellation of the $4,200 automated transfer I had executed from my truck the previous night. Gerald worked at his keyboard for a moment. He nodded. The transfer to Donovan's mortgage escrow had been permanently revoked. The funds were secured in my primary holding account. That should have closed the meeting. The hemorrhage of my retirement had been stopped. But an engineer's instincts hum at a frequency that doesn't go quiet on command. The contempt I had been shown on that porch was too complete, too deliberate to be simple entitlement. It was the arrogance of a man who was convinced he had total, untouchable control over his income source. I asked Gerald to run a full audit of all auxiliary accounts. The printer in the corner began to hum. Gerald gathered the stack of pages and laid them on the desk. He glanced at the top sheet, brow drawing together in quiet confusion. He slid it across the polished surface toward me and asked whether I wanted to review the activity on the joint emergency checking account. I looked at the numbers on the page. For a fraction of a second, they blurred, and then a ghost from the worst year of my life walked back into the room. 10 years ago, when my wife was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. Our lives collapsed into an endless rotation of hospital stays and hospice care. I had opened this particular high-yield checking account as a dedicated reservoir for the flood of medical expenses to ensure her final days were met with every comfort available. And because I spent those days and nights terrified that the strain might put me in a hospital bed of my own, I added Donovan as a secondary signer to the account. I told him plainly this was a failsafe, a glass to be broken only if I was incapacitated. My wife passed away 5 years ago. I had not touched that account since the day I settled her final funeral expenses. I had left the remaining balance, roughly $80,000, sitting there to gather interest. A silent monument to the worst year of my life. I looked at the paper Gerald had handed me. The current balance was not $80,000. It was barely $14,000. A cold, mechanical clarity moved through me. I did not gasp. I simply asked Gerald to print the itemized withdrawal history for the past 24 months. The printer came to life again, churning out transaction logs. I lifted the stack and began to read with the same detached scrutiny I applied to failed steel cables on a collapsed suspension bridge. The pattern was rhythmic, consistent, and predatory. On the third day of every single month, exactly $1,500 had been transferred out of the medical emergency fund. I traced the routing numbers. The destination was not a hospital. It was not a pharmacy. The money was being funneled directly into a secondary checking account, held solely by Donovan and Petra. I told Gerald to trace exactly where those funds had gone. The transfers ran between linked internal accounts, which gave him the clearance to follow the money all the way to its final destination. His typing slowed as his face drained of color. He was beginning to grasp what the records were showing him. The money I had ring-fenced for a dying woman's care was being systematically redirected to bankroll a luxury lifestyle. $700 a month flowed straight to the Bellevue Country Club, covering their exclusive couples membership. Another $800 a month went out on auto draft to a high-end vehicle leasing company downtown. Donovan and Petra were cruising around their gated subdivision in 2 imported silver SUVs, wearing their prosperity like a costume. Every payment drawn from the account I had built to keep his mother comfortable in her final months. I sat very still in Gerald's office. The only sound was the low drone of the climate system overhead. What I had understood as betrayal was reclassifying itself inside my mind. What happened on the porch the previous night was cruelty, personal, emotional, petty. What I was looking at now was a predatory financial operation. Donovan hadn't simply barred me from a holiday party. For months, he had been bleeding my savings dry while standing in my presence with a straight face, converting my grief into spending money. I wasn't his father in this arrangement. I was a resource to be drawn down to zero. Gerald shifted uncomfortably and asked whether I intended to contest the withdrawals. He explained the bank's position plainly. Donovan's name was on the account as an authorized signer, which made every transfer technically legitimate from an administrative standpoint. There was no mechanism for the institution to pursue him over money. He had a legal right to move whatever the moral reality of it. I set the paperwork down without a word. Disputing charges through a customer complaint form was nowhere on my agenda. What I wanted was to cut him off completely. I told Gerald to lock the account down at once, a full freeze on every product and instrument connected to my identity, with a requirement for my in-person appearance and government-issued identification before a single dollar could be moved again. I watched him work through the security protocols until Donovan's electronic access was wiped from the system entirely. Gerald was still navigating between screens when something made him stop. His hand stalled above the mouse. He met my eyes with an expression that sat somewhere between discomfort and genuine sorrow. He asked carefully whether I had recently authorized any new credit against the medical account. I told him I hadn't touched a line of credit in more than 10 years. Gerald rotated the monitor to face me. 3 months earlier, someone had used the joint checking account as collateral to open an unsecured loan worth $45,000. The approval rested on the existing cash balance. The entire amount had been drawn down and spent inside of 2 weeks. Every dollar went to a premium renovation contractor. Petra had decided the outdoor entertaining space needed a full overhaul before her next round of corporate events. My eyes went to the digital signature at the foot of the credit application on the screen. A loan of that size required the primary account holder's authorization. The name at the bottom was mine. I moved closer to read it properly. I am an engineer. 40 years of this work means my signature is something I built deliberately, a locked sequence of sharp angles and controlled proportions that doesn't deviate. What was on that screen was nothing like it. The loops sprawled. The pen pressure wandered all over the line. It had the quality of something dashed off by a man under pressure. Someone who had studied the original just long enough to attempt a rough imitation. Donovan had forged my name. This was no longer a family matter playing out in emotional territory. When someone takes unauthorized money from a shared account, you have a civil dispute, messy, difficult to prosecute, easy to dismiss. But putting a forged signature on a federally insured credit application and walking away with $45,000. That is a different country entirely. Wire fraud, identity theft, criminal financial elder abuse. I directed Gerald to produce a complete printout of the fraudulent application, forged signature included, and to have it stamped with the bank's official verification seal. I offered no explanation of what came next. I folded the documents into a neat stack, tucked them inside my coat, shook Gerald's hand, and headed for the door. He called after me apologizing for the situation and offering to escalate the matter to the fraud team. I told him no. Running this through internal bank channels would cost me time I wasn't willing to spend. I pushed out through the glass doors and back into the December cold. The sky overhead had gone the color of ash, flat, lightless, indifferent. I got into the truck and started the engine. I didn't point it toward home. Calling Donovan to rage at him over what he'd done would only hand him a head start time to rehearse his story, to move money, to construct whatever version of events suited him. I drove instead toward the city center, toward the downtown towers. I wasn't headed to anyone who trafficked in feelings or family reconciliation. The man I was going to see made his living by taking apart financial structures and reducing them to components. What Donovan had handed me, the forged signature. The records, all of it, was the precise engineering diagram I needed to collapse everything he had built at my expense. He had ignored every warning sign. The load-bearing elements had failed. The demolition was ready to begin. My phone didn't make a sound. The whole drive. Donovan had no idea the account was locked. He didn't know the credit line had been flagged. He was sitting inside his craftsman house believing the ground under him was solid. I held the accelerator steady, the engine turning over with a quiet, purposeful hum as the towers came into view. Observation was finished. The audit was closed. It was time to present the invoice. I left the truck 2 blocks from a glass and steel high-rise that punched up through the winter skyline. Inside it sat the most lethal corporate litigation practice in the state. The lobby floor was marble. My boots left wet prints across it as I walked to the front desk. The receptionist's eyes moved over my faded canvas coat with the careful neutrality of someone trained not to show disdain openly. She asked if I needed directions. I told her I had an appointment with Clifford. Clifford didn't do family law. Custody arrangements and contested divorces were beneath his interest. He took corporations apart at the seams. He converted hostile balance sheets into rubble. He dressed well and operated without sentiment. And everything he had built in that office he owed to my late wife. 30 years back, when Clifford was a sharp, broke kid from our block, with a law school acceptance letter and no way to fund it. She had written the check. He never let himself forget it. The moment he spotted me from across the lobby, he came straight over past the receptionist and pulled me into an embrace. He walked me back through the glass-walled corridors and into the corner office where the frozen city spread out beneath the windows. He poured 2 glasses of rye whiskey and pushed one toward me across the mahogany desk. He took one look at the state of my clothes and let out a slow breath through his nose. He wanted to know how much longer I planned to keep this performance going, when I was finally going to quit living like a man with nothing and start drawing on what was actually mine. I wrapped my hands around the glass and felt the heat of it cut through the cold, still sitting in my fingers. I drank slowly. I told him the performance had run its course. The stress test, I said, had come back with catastrophic findings. Clifford settled back into his chair and said nothing, because he already understood. He was the sole living person who held the full picture of where I actually stood financially. When my wife died 5 years ago, she didn't leave behind only silence and an empty house. Over the course of our marriage, we had invested hard commercial real estate early positions in technology sectors, the kind of moves most people are too cautious to make. We left the principal untouched and drew our living from my salary, letting the returns build quietly year after year. When she passed, those accounts carried $200,000 in liquid capital. Donovan never knew. Petra never knew. When the two of them groaned about wedding debt and tight finances, I played the role of a retiree stretching a modest fund. I bought their house through a blind. LLC moved into a cramped apartment above a laundromat and rotated through the same 3 pairs of jeans for 5 years. The entire point was to find out what kind of man my son had become. Would he show up for a father who had nothing left to give beyond his presence? Was what he felt for me real? Or was it a transaction? A relationship kept warm by the heat of a regular payment. I laid it all out for Clifford while the snow drove against the glass behind him. I described standing on that freezing porch on Christmas Eve, while my son told me I didn't fit the look they were going for. I told him what they had done to my access to Nolan. I told him about canceling the automated mortgage payment that morning. Clifford listened without making a sound. His instincts were already running the numbers on the damage. He asked what else I had done. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and laid the thick stack of papers Gerald had printed onto his desk. I told him I had run a full audit on the joint emergency checking account we opened 10 years ago to manage my wife's hospice expenses. Clifford slid on his reading glasses and bent over the documents. The room went very quiet as his finger moved down the itemized transaction logs line by line. He caught the pattern immediately. He saw the monthly parasitic drain of $1,500 month after month without exception. He traced the routing numbers to the vehicle leases and the country club dues. His face settled into a mask of professional cold. He looked up and confirmed what Gerald had already told me. From a civil standpoint, Clifford said this was a difficult case. I had made Donovan a secondary signer on the account during my wife's illness, which meant he technically held the administrative right to move those funds. A civil judge might look at the whole picture and conclude that a generous father had simply been subsidizing his son's lifestyle of his own accord. The law has little appetite for punishing a son who raided his dying mother's medical fund to cover golf dues when the father handed him the key. Civil litigation would grind on for years, burn through my energy, and end with a penalty that amounted to a footnote. I said nothing. I waited. I knew what was sitting further down in that stack of papers. Clifford turned the page. He went quiet. The atmosphere in the room changed. He was reading the unsecured credit application for $45,000, the one that directed funds to a high-end home renovation firm. He noted the date the account was opened 3 months prior. Then his eyes dropped to the digital signature at the foot of the page. He studied the loose, erratic loops that were supposed to represent my name. He knew my handwriting. Over the years, he had seen my signature on precise architectural drawings and legal instruments too many times to count. Clifford set his glasses down slowly on the desk. His voice dropped a register. He asked me directly, had I authorized that credit extension? Had I signed that document? I met his eyes without blinking. I told him I had not been near that account in 5 years. I told him my son had fabricated that signature to pull $45,000 to build Petra an outdoor entertainment space for her corporate events. A slow, deliberate smile moved across Clifford's face. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely. We were no longer talking about a mistreated father trying to claw back money taken from his grocery fund. We were holding something with real destructive potential. Clifford leaned forward, both hands folded on the mahogany surface. He laid out precisely what we had in front of us. This was no longer a messy domestic quarrel over a shared bank account. This was a federal. Donovan had transmitted a falsified document across state banking lines to secure funds under fraudulent pretenses. That was aggravated identity theft. That was financial elder abuse. And above everything else, that was federal wire fraud. Clifford walked me through the architecture of the trap we were about to construct. A civil filing would only prompt them to retain a defense attorney and begin sheltering their assets. We needed the mechanism to close around them on its own. We needed to drive them into a corner tight enough that their own arrogance would push them into a terminal mistake. I asked what our opening move should be. He told me to do nothing at all. Go back to my apartment, he said, and let the silence do the work. The mortgage payment had already failed to clear. The automated alerts were hitting Donovan's phone right now. When he tried to log into the emergency medical account, to pull funds and plug the gap, he would find every access point sealed by the bank's fraud controls. The panic would take hold quickly. Donovan and Petra were running a lifestyle they had never once paid for themselves: imported cars on lease country club, dues the full performance of affluence. They had been living month to month on my invisible support. Once that flow stopped entirely, their whole operation would start to buckle within days. Clifford was certain that desperation would produce mistakes. They would come after me. They would demand the money be reinstated. And when they arrived, they would lean on intimidation to try to force my hand. Clifford stood and crossed to a secure filing cabinet. He pulled a fresh block of legal paper and said it was time to load the heavy guns, because my limited liability company held the deed to the house outright, and Donovan was nothing more than an occupant whose payments had been an elaborate fiction. We held complete authority over the property. Clifford began drafting a formal 30-day notice to vacate immediate, unambiguous no room to maneuver. We would not mail it. We would not send a courier. We would hold it until they came to us. We would let them escalate, let them threaten, let them display exactly what they were. And then, at the precise peak of their entitlement, we would put the eviction notice in their hands. I finished the rye whiskey. It traced a slow, steady heat down into my chest. The grief had burned off completely. What remained was clarity. My son had stood in his doorway on a freezing night and decided that my appearance was an embarrassment to be hidden from his guests. He had looked at the fund I built for his mother's final days and redirected it to a country club. He had signed my name to a loan application to pave over a patio. I told Clifford to draw up every document necessary. No loopholes, no grace periods, no surface for negotiation to gain any purchase. Clifford nodded. He told me that when this was over, Donovan and Petra would be standing with nothing, no house, no cars, and if they decided to push back hard enough, no freedom. I shook his hand, buttoned my coat, and walked out of the corner office. The elevator carried me down to the lobby, and I stepped back into the blizzard. The snow was deep on the sidewalks, pressing the city flat and white. I got into the truck and drove back across town to my cramped, noisy apartment above the laundromat. My phone stayed silent on the seat the whole way. I knew Donovan had stopped dialing. He was standing somewhere staring at his banking app, watching the accounts refuse to open. I knew exactly what that pressure felt like spreading through a person's chest. I parked, climbed the narrow staircase to my apartment, and sat down in the dark. No television, no lights, just the shadows and the silence and the patience of a man who had already made every necessary calculation. The trap was armed. The bait was in place. The instrument was sharpened and waiting. The drive back from Clifford's office was a smear of gray slush and slow traffic. When I finally pulled in behind the brick building, the low mechanical hum of the laundry machines below came up through the floor to meet me. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs. My knees ached in the winter cold, but my mind was running with frictionless precision. I let myself into the apartment and stood in the cramped space for a moment. For 5 years, I had occupied this small box, performing the role of a man who had given everything away just to take an honest measurement of my son's character. The experiment was finished. The data was in. I draped my damp coat over the chair and spread the bank documents flat across the kitchen table. I am an engineer by vocation and by instinct. When a structure fails, you don't react emotionally. You locate the stress fractures. You calculate the total load bearing down on the system. Then you execute a controlled demolition. I went to the kitchen drawer and took out an engineering notebook and a drafting pen. I sat at the table and began to chart the complete dismantling of my son's constructed world. Phase 1 demanded total surveillance. Donovan had always carried a volatile temper beneath the surface. I remembered a summer evening 20 years back when he didn't make the cut for his high school baseball team. He came through the front door and drove a bat straight through the glass panel of our garage door. When something he felt entitled to was taken away, his emotional regulation collapsed entirely. And now I was about to take away everything. The moment the bank locked him out of the funds he'd been stealing, I knew the panic would convert into something physical. Every second of what followed needed to be on record. I left my apartment and drove out to an electronics supply store on the edge of town. I bought 4 high-definition wireless surveillance cameras with cloud storage built in. Back home, the next 2 hours went toward getting them mounted. The first went directly above the front door lens, angled to take in the full length of the narrow hallway. If Donovan came to rattle me, his face and every word out of his mouth would be pushed straight to a remote server. The second camera I tucked inside the living room slipped behind a row of hardcover books on an upper shelf. It gave a clean, unbroken sightline across the kitchen table and the entryway. I dialed Clifford on the prepaid phone and told him I needed his office wired for audio and video before the day was out. He agreed without hesitation. I understood the legal value of catching a cornered man in a lie. I drove back downtown and spent an hour working through Clifford's law firm. We fitted a discreet lens in the lobby to catch anyone who walked in looking for trouble. A second camera went inside his mahogany corner office, positioned to frame whoever settled into the client chairs. We tied all 4 feeds to a secure application on my phone. I stood in Clifford's office and ran the audio test. The clarity was unsettling. Every footstep, every rustle of paper, every spoken threat would be preserved with crystalline perfection. We were ready for whatever came next. I drove back to the apartment as the winter sun was dropping below the roofline. The streetlights came on outside my window, throwing long shadows across the floor. The time had come to begin the legal demolition of Donovan's tidy suburban life. I pulled my heavy metal lockbox from its place and drew out the original incorporation documents for the limited liability company I had put together 4 years prior. When I purchased the 4-bedroom craftsman house in a gated subdivision for Donovan and Petra, I had deliberately routed the acquisition through a corporate entity registered in Delaware. My intention was to keep my wealth out of public records, but the structure also handed me absolute unyielding authority over the asset. Donovan and Petra had always assumed I had simply co-signed a conventional mortgage. They believed their names sat on the deed alongside mine. They were completely mistaken. I smoothed the heavy parchment flat against the table. The documents made one thing clear: my corporate entity was the sole legal owner of that property. Donovan and Petra were legally classified as month-to-month tenants. The $4,200 they demanded I transfer every month was never a mortgage payment. It was rent, and because I had just canceled that transfer, they were officially in default. I uncapped my drafting pen and set to work. I drafted a formal corporate resolution dissolving the current tenancy agreement on the grounds of non-payment. I laid out the precise statutes that authorized an immediate termination of their occupancy. My handwriting moved across the page in sharp, deliberate strokes. I set my clean signature on the corporate filings next to the sloppy, hurried forgery Donovan had submitted to the bank for his $45,000 credit line. The contrast was the distance between a master builder and a careless thief. I prepared the formal 30-day notice to vacate. I did not soften a single word. I offered no grace period, no chance to negotiate arrears. The notice stated plainly that the occupants had defaulted on their financial obligations and were required to surrender all keys and clear the property by the close of the upcoming month. Failure to comply would bring the county sheriff's department to the door. I slid the signed eviction notice into a thick brown envelope. I added a certified copy of the original deed confirming they held zero equity in the home. Then I included a printed summary of the joint medical account, the steady parasitic draw of $1,500 every month laid out in black and white. I wanted them to see the precise mechanism of their own undoing. I wanted them to know that I had traced every dollar they had siphoned from my dead wife's hospice fund to cover their Bellevue Country Club dues. I sealed the envelope and set it in the center of the kitchen table. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. The transformation was complete. The grieving father who had stood shivering on a snowy porch 24 hours earlier was gone. He had died the moment his son told him to leave the Christmas gifts on the wet welcome mat, like a hired servant. What remained in that chair was a structural engineer who had just pulled the foundational pillars out from under a corrupt building. I crossed to the small kitchenette and drew a glass of tap water. I stood at the window and looked down at the frozen street. Snow was coming down in heavy, wordless drifts. I took out my phone and opened the security application. The screen divided into 4 separate grids. The empty hallway outside my apartment door. The still interior of my own living room. The dark, composed lobby of Clifford's law firm. The vacant leather chairs in his corner office. The stage was set exactly as I had designed it. Every angle covered. Every legal document signed and sealed. The offshore accounts secured behind layers of encrypted protection. Donovan and Petra had spent years treating me like a mindless utility, an automated clearinghouse that required no upkeep and deserved no regard. They had taken my silence as evidence of weakness and senility. They had badly underestimated the patience of a man who builds things to last. I knew how their panic would unspool. The holiday weekend was drawing to a close. Come morning, the automated banking systems would resume normal processing. The cancellation of the large rent transfer would set off a chain of alerts. When Donovan logged into his portal to confirm the funds, he would find the digital gates shut and locked. When he reached for the medical emergency fund to plug the gap, he would trip the fraud flags I had arranged with the bank manager. Their polished, self-satisfied world was about to experience a total systemic failure. The luxury vehicle leases would go unpaid. The neighborhood association fees would go uncovered. The carefully assembled facade of their success would crack apart in full view of their prestigious social circle. I set my phone beside the brown envelope on the table. I lowered myself into the wooden chair and sat in the quiet. I felt no anger. What I felt was an absolute chilling equilibrium. The load-bearing walls of their deception were giving way. The collapse was no longer a question of if. It was an inevitable mathematical certainty. I watched the digital clock on my phone move forward minute by minute, knowing the flood of missed calls was only hours out. I folded my hands on the table and let the silence settle over me. The architect was ready. The demolition had begun. January 1st arrived on the back of a brutal, unforgiving frost that sheeted the apartment windows in solid ice. The city beneath was absolutely still. The laundromat on the ground floor was shuttered for the holiday, and the usual low groan of delivery trucks was nowhere in the empty streets. I woke at exactly 6:00 in the morning, as I always do. No alarm required. 40 years of reaching construction sites before sunrise had calibrated something deep in my internal clock. I moved into the cramped kitchen and filled the coffee pot. The linoleum floor was cold against my bare feet. I pressed the button on the machine and watched the dark liquid fall slowly into the glass carafe. I took my seat at the small wooden table and looked at my smartphone lying on the surface. The digital clock read 6:30. Midnight had come and gone 6.5 hours ago. In the sterile, air-conditioned server rooms of Heritage Trust Bank, a sequence of automated scripts had already run their daily protocols. Algorithms had swept across the network of accounts, scanning for scheduled directives. For 4 years, those algorithms had found my primary holding account, lifted $4,200 from it, and routed it into the escrow account, tied to my son's suburban property. But the night before, the algorithms came up empty. The standing order had been permanently erased. The digital pathway was severed. I knew exactly how the banking system worked. When a high-value automated transfer fails to execute on the first of the month, the system moves immediately. It generates a deficiency notice. It assembles an automated email and fires it to the primary contact on file. Donovan would have received that email in the early morning hours while he was still sleeping off whatever New Year's Eve had cost him. I poured my coffee and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug. I did not have to sit with the silence long. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the phone on the table began to vibrate. The sudden sound was sharp and invasive in the quiet apartment. The screen lit up the dim kitchen, flashing the name Donovan in bright white letters. I made no move toward the phone. I sat without shifting and took a slow sip of black coffee. I watched it vibrate against the wood until the call rolled to voicemail. A small notification appeared on the screen. A moment later, the phone started up again and then again. I simply let it run. I was conducting a structural stress test on my son's psychological endurance. I needed to document the precise rate at which his entitlement eroded into outright terror. After the fifth unanswered call in a row, I tapped the screen and opened the voicemail application. I hit play on the first message and let the audio spill into the kitchen. "Dad, pick up the phone." Donovan's voice was thick with sleep and blunt irritation. "I just woke up and saw some email from the bank. It says the escrow transfer bounced or got canceled or something. Petra is extremely annoyed because she has a spa appointment this morning, and this is stressing her out. Call the bank and sort out whatever technical glitch you caused. Let me know when it's done." The message ended with a hard click. No greeting. No wish for a happy new year. Just a direct order from a man who genuinely believed the world existed to accommodate his schedule. He had no doubt it was a technical error. His arrogance made it impossible for him to entertain the idea that the machine he depended on had deliberately chosen to stop. The morning stretched into afternoon. The sky outside the window was flat and gray, offering nothing in the way of light. The temperature kept falling, and the snow resumed coming down in thick, blinding curtains. My phone sat untouched on the table. It rang every 15 minutes with clockwork regularity. I noted each timestamp in my engineering notebook. Call 12 at 10:45. Call 15 at 11:30. Call 22 at 1:15. I worked through the next set of voicemails. The irritation in Donovan's voice had curdled into real anger. He was speaking much louder now. I was no longer calling from bed. I could make out the echo of his footsteps crossing the hardwood floors of the house I had bought. "Vernon, this is not a joke." He had dropped the word "dad" entirely. "The bank customer service line is closed for the holiday, and I cannot reach anyone who can override this. You need to answer me right now. I tried logging into the emergency medical account to pull the mortgage funds manually, and the entire portal is locked. It says my access has been permanently revoked due to suspicious activity. What did you do? Turn my access back on right now before I come down there and make you do it." I wrote the words "suspicious activity" in my engineering notebook. The fraud protocols I had put in place with the branch manager were working exactly as designed. Donovan had tried to raid the hospice funds to bail himself out, and had driven straight into a digital, reinforced steel barrier. The lifeline was severed. The emergency reserves were sealed off. I was stranded on an island of his own construction, and the water was climbing fast. By 3:00 in the afternoon, the missed call count had reached 30. I sat in my small living room, the legal documents stacked neatly before me, listening to my son's reality come apart at the seams. The 28th voicemail was frantic. Petra was shouting in the background. Her voice was sharp and laced with panic. I could hear her demanding to know why her credit card had been declined at a luxury boutique downtown. The shock was radiating through every corner of their financial life. "Dad, answer the phone." Donovan's voice was shaking now. The hard bravado had drained completely out of it. He sounded breathless, like a man running low on air. "Petra just got embarrassed at the store. The bank locked our joint checking account. They locked the credit line. They locked everything. I do not understand what is happening. Please call me back. We need that money today, or the auto lease is going to default tomorrow morning. Please." I let the recording finish. I felt my pulse slow and level out. I felt no satisfaction, only the cold comfort of a mathematical equation settling into balance. For years, they had treated my resources as an endless self-refilling reservoir. They had leased imported vehicles and joined exclusive clubs on money set aside to ease a dying woman's suffering. They had left me standing in freezing sleet because my worn jacket embarrassed them in front of their corporate friends. They had read my silence as a sign of weakness. They were now discovering that my silence had always been the sound of a predator waiting without movement in the dark. The afternoon gave way to a bleak, frozen evening. Shadows stretched the length of the apartment walls. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in the dark, lit only by the faint blue glow of the phone screen. At 6:45, the phone vibrated for the 40th time. I let it ring out. I watched the voicemail icon appear. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The voice that came through the speaker was completely unrecognizable. It was not the voice of the arrogant man who had ordered me off his porch. It was not the voice of the entitled son demanding I fix a technical glitch. It was the sound of a broken, terrified animal. "Dad, please." Donovan's voice was choked with tears. He was crying. He was gasping between words. "Please pick up. I am begging you." An automated courier just taped a pre-foreclosure warning to our front door. The bank system automatically flagged the house because the primary escrow has a zero balance, and the linked line of credit is currently under federal review for fraud. They said the fraud division is opening an investigation. Petra is packing a bag. She says she is leaving. "Please, Dad. I have nothing. I cannot access a single dollar. They are going to take the house. Please tell me this is just a mistake. I am sorry about Christmas. I am so sorry. Please call me back." The message cut off abruptly, replaced by the mechanical silence of the application. I set the phone face down on the table. The stress test was officially concluded. The structure had failed completely. His entire life had been built on stolen capital and fraudulent signatures. The moment the bank uncovered the forgery on the $45,000 credit line, they had frozen his entire financial network in place. The automated warning taped to his door was only the first tremor ahead of the earthquake. He was broke. He was terrified. He was completely alone. I reached over and lifted the thick brown envelope from the table. Inside sat the formal 30-day eviction notice, legally dissolving his tenancy and requiring him to surrender the property immediately. I ran my finger along the sealed edge. I understood that the 40 missed calls were just the opening phase. Desperation would push him out of that house. Desperation would send him through the freezing snow to my door. He would not sit waiting for a return call any longer. He would come here to demand his rescue face to face. I rose from the wooden chair and crossed to the front door. I checked the lock. I verified the angle of the hidden security camera mounted above the frame. Everything was functioning perfectly. The trap had been baited, and the quarry was hurtling blindly toward the steel jaws. I walked back to the kitchen, poured the remaining cold coffee down the drain, and settled into the silent darkness to wait for the knock at my door. It was the evening of January 3rd. The winter storm that had buried the city on New Year's Eve had hardened into a solid sheet of gray ice. I was seated at my small kitchen table with a glass of tap water. The digital clock on the microwave turned to 7:14. That was the exact moment the heavy, frantic pounding started at my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate hammering of a man who understood that his entire survival was caving in around him. The thin wood of my apartment door shuddered in its frame. I did not move quickly to answer it. I picked up my phone and opened the security application. The hallway camera showed Donovan and Petra standing beneath the flickering fluorescent light. They looked completely undone. Donovan's expensive wool overcoat was dark with melting snow. Petra was moving in tight, agitated circles, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like a shield. The hammering paused for a fraction of a second. Donovan's voice pushed through the cheap drywall. He demanded I open the door. He shouted that he knew I was inside because my truck was in the alley. I drew a slow breath. I confirmed that the hidden camera behind the bookshelf in my living room was actively recording. I got to my feet, walked across the cold linoleum floor, and turned the deadbolt. Donovan shoved the door open before I had fully pulled back the handle. He stepped into my cramped apartment with all the misplaced authority of a corporate executive dressing down a subordinate. Petra came in right on his heels. The two of them carried the winter in with them, the cold clinging to their coats. Puddles spread across my cheap floor, where their expensive boots shed their melting snow. Donovan skipped any greeting. He had no interest in how I was. A shaking finger came up level with my chest. Where had I been? Why wasn't I picking up? The bank had gone in and frozen everything. Every account, every portal, every card suspended. On top of that, the dealership had already phoned him twice, and repossession of both vehicles was on the table because the auto draft had gone dark. I did not move. I gave him the space to exhaust himself. I watched the red climb into his face, equal parts fear and outrage. No chair was offered. Their coats stayed on. Petra shoved around her husband and came at me directly. Whatever suburban polish she normally wore had burned off entirely. Her jaw was set, her eyes hard. She took in my cramped one-bedroom with a sweep that made no effort to hide her contempt. Selfish. Miserable. That was her opening. She was livid, convinced I was torching their lives deliberately, all because of a slight at a Christmas party. Her credit card had gone down in front of her senior partners at a boutique she frequented. She wanted me to understand that. She moved closer and told me I had no business cutting off their money over a grudge. The funds were owed to them, she said. I had made a commitment to help them build their life. Then she gestured at my faded canvas work shirt and told me a man living the way I did clearly had no use for the money anyway. I took every word in. My voice stayed level. I had nothing to defend. What I was receiving right there in my own home was the clearest possible evidence of what they were. 40 years of labor compressed into a retirement fund, and they were standing over it like it was an inheritance. They'd been cheated out of, insulting the man who'd built it while they demanded it. Donovan caught Petra's arm, tried to rein her in, but he was too far gone himself. He fixed those wild, cornered eyes on me. "Answer the phone," he said. His instruction was precise: call the branch manager, push through a manual wire, cover the mortgage default and the car arrears. Do that, he said, and they would put the Christmas incident behind them. They would let me back into Nolan's life next month. There it was. My grandson dangled like a tool. I studied Donovan. I noted the exact instant the load-bearing structure of his confidence started to give. Then I turned away from both of them. I moved to the kitchen table at a deliberate pace. Petra's voice went up another register. I was ignoring them, she said. Pick up the phone. I left the phone where it was. What I picked up was the thick brown envelope sitting squarely in the middle of the table. I came back to where Donovan was standing and held it out. He grabbed it from me with a sharp, impatient exhale, muttering that I could have avoided this entire circus by writing a check like a normal person. He ripped it open and dug out the documents inside. I watched his gaze move across the top sheet. I could see the effort it took his mind to parse language written by the most lethal corporate attorney I could retain. Then I saw it the moment the words landed. The bold heading at the top of the first page. 30-day notice to vacate premises. Donovan went still. Every trace of blood left his face, the skin turning the color of old ash. He held the paper the way you'd hold something that might bite. Petra grabbed his sleeve and demanded to know what she was looking at. Was it a bank form? He couldn't answer. His mouth worked without producing a sound. The document trembled in his grip, the parchment rattling in the silence of the apartment. I decided it was time to speak. My delivery was unhurried, exact, an engineer reading aloud the findings of a final inspection. I had not co-signed anything 4 years ago, I told them. Their credit history and the debt they'd carried out of their wedding had made them an unacceptable risk to every legitimate lender in this state. I had bought that 4-bedroom Craftsman property myself, paid in full in cash. The acquisition had run through a blind LLC incorporated in Delaware. That entity mine held the deed. No one else. Petra wrenched the papers from Donovan's hands and tore through the pages. Statutes, certified deed, copy, all of it. She shook her head like the words were physically wrong. A lie, she said. They owned that house. They had been carrying the mortgage for 4 years. I corrected her without raising my voice. Not $1 of theirs had gone toward that property. The $200 monthly had come out of my retirement portfolio every single time. Their legal classification was month-to-month tenant, nothing more. I had canceled the transfer. They were in default. I watched it move across Petra's face, the understanding that she possessed nothing. The house, the address, the prestige of the neighborhood rented. A stage set. Not 1 square foot of it was hers. Donovan got his voice back barely. It came out thin and unsteady, almost a whisper. How could I do this to family? How could I put them on the street over a misunderstanding? I reached past him and tapped the second document in Petra's hands. The itemized audit. Emergency medical checking account. The one I had established a decade ago when my wife needed hospice. I told Donovan plainly there was no misunderstanding. I had cataloged every withdrawal he'd run through that account across the past 2 years. The figures were in my head. $1,500 a month, redirected to keep his country club memberships current. The auto leasing payments traced back to the same well, money set aside for a dying woman routed instead into his vehicle fleet. Donovan's back found the drywall. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has just run out of exits. The audit was airtight. There was no seam left to slip through. My voice stayed flat. The final verdict came out with the precision of a load calculation. 30 days. Remove everything and leave my property. If they were still inside on day 31, the county sheriff would escort them out, bodily, and their belongings would end up on the pavement. After that, new locks and a for sale sign. Petra came for me. Her face had gone beyond anger into something colder, her nails drawing in as her hand came up. She was ready to tear into me, 4 years of manufactured status about to explode outward. I did not move back even a fraction of an inch. I pointed. At the shelf. At the lens sitting quietly between the spines of my engineering textbooks. High definition, I told her. Audio and video live right now, feeding to a remote server my legal team had eyes on. I recommended she think hard about what she did next. Petra stopped. The raised hand hung there. Understanding moved through her, not gradually, all at once. She had walked into something purpose-built. The cage had been waiting, and they had stepped inside without hesitation. It was over in that kitchen. The eviction was underway. The apartment went completely quiet. Petra stood there, arm still lifted, going nowhere. Her gaze had locked onto that small black lens nestled between my textbooks. She understood that every gesture, every word she'd produced in this room was already preserved on a server she couldn't reach. The arm came down slowly. She stepped back, her expensive boots sliding a little on the wet linoleum where she'd tracked in snow. When she looked at Donovan, there was nothing left in her expression, just the hollow blankness of someone who has watched a structure come down. The fiction of everything they'd built above me had just collapsed under its own false weight. Donovan, though, had not arrived at that stillness. Panic behaves differently than clarity. Under enough pressure, a brittle material doesn't yield. What came next is something I still carry with me. I was about to find out what my own son had truly been doing, and just how far back the betrayal ran. Before I tell you, let me ask, if someone you loved and provided for turned against you in silence, would you confront them face to face or build your case quietly before they ever saw it coming? It shatters. Donovan had spent his entire adult life shielded from the consequences of what he did. Every time a financial hole opened up or something went wrong, he simply located someone else and made them carry it. Now he was boxed into a drafty apartment, with his stolen pipeline cut off and an eviction notice printed with his name on it. The understanding that I had engineered his collapse finally broke through the arrogance, and what came out was volatile. He turned away from the brown envelope on the kitchen table and fixed his gaze on me. The polished surface of the successful suburban professional fell away completely. His shoulders dropped forward, his jaw locked. I remembered an episode from decades back. A high school counselor had disciplined him over a failed examination, and Donovan had used his physical size to back the much smaller man into a corner, forcing a passing grade through sheer intimidation. I was a bully who had always believed that volume and physical proximity could bend reality to his will. He started across the small kitchen toward me. I held my ground. I didn't shift my weight or open any distance between us. I stood the way a man stands when he knows precisely how much load a steel beam is rated to carry. Donovan came to a stop inches from my chest. He had height and mass on me, and used both, leaning his shadow across my face. He bent down, his breath carrying stale mints and sour coffee. His voice dropped into a low, vicious growl. He told me to switch off the camera. He ordered me to cross to the bookshelf, disconnect the device, and hand over the memory card. If I didn't destroy the footage on the spot, he said he would make whatever time I had left on this earth a living nightmare. I looked up at the boy I had raised and told him the camera didn't store anything locally. It fed straight to a cloud server. The footage was already locked inside a secure digital vault managed by a corporate litigation firm 2 blocks from where we were standing. His face collapsed into something beyond anger, a mask of pure, undiluted rage. Both hands came up and seized the thick fabric of my faded canvas work coat. He bunched the material in his fists and shook me hard enough to drag me a step forward. He told me I was nothing but a pathetic, lonely old man. He screamed that the house was his and the money was his. He said he had endured my dull visits and put up with my cheap gifts for years, specifically to protect his inheritance. He threatened to haul me into court and petition a judge to have me declared legally incompetent. He swore he'd produce a doctor willing to testify that I was deteriorating with severe dementia. He promised to have me committed to a state-run facility and every asset attached to my name liquidated. He was narrating his entire criminal scheme directly into an active microphone. Every threat, every confession of financial exploitation, every element of his plan to strip me of my autonomy, all of it was landing on the recording with perfect acoustic clarity. He was handing me the material to seal his own fate. Petra lunged forward and grabbed his shoulder. She yanked at his jacket, her voice climbing into a frantic, high-pitched pitch. She told him to stop talking. She begged him to release my coat. She was pointing wildly at the blinking red light on the camera, fully grasping the magnitude of the legal exposure they had just walked into. She understood that threatening to falsely institutionalize an elderly man while physically assaulting him was an indefensible felony. Donovan ignored her. He knocked her hand aside and tightened his fists in my collar. He shook me again and demanded I pick up my phone and call the bank to unlock the emergency medical account. He said I was going to wire the $45,000 to him right now, or he would put me through the front window. I didn't fight his grip. My right hand moved slowly into the deep front pocket of my trousers. My fingers found the smooth glass face of my smartphone. I had mapped this sequence out in advance. When Clifford and I wired the apartment that afternoon, we built in an emergency protocol. I had set up a silent panic trigger on the side of the device. One sustained press of the volume key would fire a distress signal to Clifford's personal line, along with a live audio feed from my location. I pressed it and held it down. A brief silent vibration told me the signal had gone out. I looked at Donovan. I told him he was committing a fundamental engineering error. Applying blunt force to a reinforced structure, I said, only guarantees the destruction of whatever is doing the applying. He pulled his right fist back, a raw animal sound building at the back of his throat. He told me to shut up and hand over the money. Before the swing could come forward, the heavy wooden door blew open with a crash that shook the drywall behind it. Two uniformed police officers moved into the narrow entryway, hands resting on their utility belts, faces set like poured concrete. A blast of frozen air came in with them. Behind them stood Clifford. He had on an immaculate navy wool suit, not a thread disturbed by the blizzard he'd just walked through. A leather folio was tucked under one arm. He took in the room with the cold, satisfied eye of a man watching a plan conclude exactly as drawn. The lead officer pointed a gloved finger at Donovan. He ordered him to release me and step back with his hands where they could be seen. Donovan went rigid. The animal rage that had been flooding his face drained out of it, and what replaced it was the pale, trembling cowardice of a bully who has just run into something bigger than himself. His fists opened, and my coat fell free. He lurched backward, both hands rising, his eyes ricocheting between the officers and the attorney standing in my doorway. He tried to speak. He reached for the polished, confident tone he used to deploy at the Bellevue Country Club. What came out was a stammer. He said it was a misunderstanding, a private family matter, and that his father had been suffering from serious cognitive decline. He claimed he had come to settle me down because I was deep in a confusion episode. Clifford stepped inside. He didn't look at Donovan. He addressed the officers directly. He informed them that the apartment was fully wired with high-definition audio and video surveillance. He had been watching the live feed from his office down the street. He told the officers he had clearly heard the suspect threaten to throw a 71-year-old man through a glass window in order to force an unauthorized wire transfer. Petra began to cry. Not performed tears, genuine suffocating ones that tracked down her face and pulled her expensive makeup with them. She sagged against the kitchen counter, her face going into her hands. She knew the career, the social standing, the freedom, all of it was finished. The second officer drew a small notepad from his breast pocket. He told Donovan they had already been listening through the open emergency line before they entered the hallway. He said they were formally documenting forced entry, trespassing, and the verbal assault of a senior citizen. He asked Donovan to produce identification. Donovan's hands shook badly as he reached into his pocket. He got his wallet out and surrendered his license to the officer. Then he looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was a plea. He told me to tell them it was a joke. He asked me to say we were just going back and forth over a football game. He called me Dad for the first time all evening, and without a trace of the aggression that had filled every other word out of his mouth. He sounded exactly the way he had at 8 years old when he was frightened. I straightened my collar. I smoothed the fabric of my coat where his fists had worked it. I looked at the man in front of me and registered nothing. The foundation was gone. The bridge was gone. Only open space remained. I turned to face the officers. I told them the man and woman in my kitchen were unwanted trespassers. I explained that I had recently moved to evict them from a property held by my corporate entity due to serious financial delinquency. I confirmed they had entered my home intending to physically coerce me into releasing funds they had stolen. I asked that a formal incident report be generated immediately to support the litigation that was coming. Clifford allowed himself a thin, razor-edged smile. He advised the officers that his firm would have a permanent restraining order in hand by the following morning, grounded in the documented assault on record. The lead officer gave a single nod. He turned to face Donovan and Petra and ordered them into the hallway. He made clear they were being formally removed from the premises and that any attempt to contact me or re-enter the building would result in immediate arrest for aggravated assault and trespassing. Donovan tried to resist. He attempted to plant his feet on the linoleum floor. His eyes went to the brown envelope still sitting on the kitchen table, the document that contained the death warrant for the life he had built. The officer moved in and placed a firm hand on Donovan's shoulder, rotating him physically toward the door. Petra did not fight it. She walked out with her chin down, staring blankly at the wet floorboards. She had the look of someone already gone. I stood in the center of my small kitchen and watched the officers walk my son and his wife down the narrow, poorly lit hallway. The sound of their footsteps against the walls faded into the winter night. Clifford shut the apartment door and cut off the cold draft. He crossed to the table and pressed one finger against the thick brown envelope. He looked at me and nodded. The documentation was clean and complete. The physical threat had been captured on recording confirmed and officially logged with law enforcement. Donovan had supplied precisely the legal ammunition needed to dismantle any defense he might later try to assemble. The trap hadn't merely closed, it had locked. I moved to the sink and drew a glass of cold water. I drank it slowly, feeling the chill move down my throat. The mask had come off entirely. What my family actually was had been laid bare under the harsh light of consequence. The confrontation itself was finished, but the structural collapse of their world was only now beginning to pick up speed. I settled back into the wooden chair and picked up my drafting pen. There was considerable work still ahead. The federal wire fraud charges were the next load-bearing element to set in place. I opened my engineering notebook to a clean page, the quiet of the empty apartment, not troubling me in the least. The natural order was being restored. 2 days went by after the police walked my son out of my apartment. The silence inside my home was deep and unbroken. I occupied the time organizing the digital records of my financial history. A desperate man does not simply accept defeat and disappear into the cold. When an animal is snared, it does not stop to consider the ethics of its predicament. It tears through its own flesh to get free. I was waiting for Donovan to start chewing through the bone. On the morning of January 5th, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Clifford. No small talk. He told me to get to his office immediately. The opposition had made their move, and it was a direct attack on my personal autonomy. I drove through the gray downtown slush and walked into Clifford's office and took my seat across from him. He set a thick binder on the mahogany desk and looked at me with the cold focus of a man who has seen exactly this before. Donovan and Petra had retained a predatory family law attorney, he said. They had filed an emergency petition in county court that morning. They were seeking immediate temporary guardianship over both my person and my estate. Clifford walked me through the contents. Donovan alleged that my sudden financial decisions were the product of aggressive early-onset dementia. He claimed I was gripped by severe paranoia and delusions. He argued that my choice to evict my own family and freeze the medical accounts was proof I was no longer capable of rational judgment. He was asking a judge to hand him total authority over my physical well-being and full control of my corporate entities, ostensibly to protect me from myself. I absorbed the allegations with a kind of detached fascination. It was a complete structural inversion. They were attempting to use the direct consequences of their own theft as clinical evidence of my mental deterioration. Because I had shut off the pipeline they were stealing from, they were now calling me unfit. The petition even reached back to Christmas Eve. Petra had submitted a sworn statement claiming I had appeared on their porch in the freezing rain, completely disoriented, not knowing where I was, and that I turned physically aggressive when they tried to assist me. They had taken my patient endurance of their cruelty and recast it as a psychiatric episode. I asked Clifford how any judge could entertain such a claim without independent medical documentation. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. An affidavit of cognitive decline, signed by a physician named Dr. Pruitt. I studied the signature. I had never encountered a Dr. Pruitt in my life. My late wife had spent her final weeks in the care of hospice nurses and oncologists I knew by name. I had not visited a doctor for anything beyond a routine physical in 10 years. I asked Clifford how Petra had managed to find a licensed physician willing to stake his credentials on a fabricated document. Clifford laid out the social mechanics. Petra had spent years embedding herself in the right circles through the Bellevue Country Club, financing her access with money drained from the hospice account. Dr. Pruitt was a familiar presence at those events. He operated a boutique wellness clinic that served executives who needed discreet prescriptions and questionable medical waivers. He was practiced at bending professional standards in exchange for compensation. Petra had used what remained of her social capital to persuade him that I was genuinely senile and that the paperwork was nothing more than a family safeguard. He signed the affidavit without ever setting eyes on me, operating on the assumption that a man living above a laundromat would never command the resources to challenge a well-connected physician in court. It was a fatal miscalculation built entirely on arrogance. Clifford leaned forward and placed both hands on the desk. He spelled out the stakes with precision. This was no longer a civil matter over unpaid rent or quiet transfers between bank accounts. Filing a fabricated medical affidavit before a federal judge in order to seize control of an elderly man's assets was perjury, a serious felony. They had crossed from entitled theft into the territory of criminals prepared to strip away my fundamental rights to preserve their standard of living. If the judge issued the temporary order, Donovan would gain immediate access to the offshore accounts and the power to reverse the eviction. I asked what our first countermove should be. Clifford said we could file a motion to dismiss the petition immediately. We had enough to expose the affidavit as a forgery before any hearing took place. But Clifford had no interest in stopping the hearing. He wanted Donovan and Petra to walk into that courtroom and place the fraudulent document before a judge on the official record. He wanted them to commit perjury in open court. To make that trap work, we needed an airtight defense. Clifford told me to leave his office and drive directly to the State Medical University Hospital. He had already arranged an appointment with the head of the neurology department, a highly regarded specialist who regularly testified as an expert witness in complex estate proceedings. I was to undergo a full psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. We needed proof that was absolute and beyond any challenge. I left the law firm and drove to the hospital. I spent 4 hours in a sterile examination room. I approached every test the way I would approach verifying the tensile strength of a suspension bridge with total precision and no margin for error. Spatial reasoning puzzles solved without hesitation. Complex numerical sequences recited from memory without a stumble. Detailed questions about my financial history, my corporate structures, the specific dates of long-term investments. I answered each one cleanly and completely. My mind is a fortress built from logic and mathematics. There are no fractures in the foundation. The neurologist reviewed my results quietly. He looked at the scores, then looked at me with something that read like genuine professional respect. He told me my cognitive function was not just normal for a man of my age. It was exceptional. He produced a comprehensive 20-page report certifying complete mental clarity and full executive function. He applied the official seal of the university hospital and signed his name with the deliberate weight of someone who understood what that signature would be used for. I carried the sealed report back to Clifford's office late in the afternoon and set it on the mahogany desk beside the fraudulent affidavit Donovan had purchased. The contrast between the two documents was the difference between a solid concrete foundation and a pillar of crumbling sand. Clifford allowed himself his cold, predatory smile. He placed both documents into his heavy leather briefcase. Then he walked me through the timeline of what came next. The emergency hearing was set for the following Tuesday morning. Donovan and Petra were convinced they had caught me off guard. They believed their high-priced attorney and their bought medical document would be more than enough to persuade the judge to strip away my rights and hand them control of everything I had built. They imagined I was huddled in my little apartment, rattled and disoriented by the legal barrage coming at me. What they had absolutely no idea about was that we were entirely ready to stand back and let them bury themselves in front of a magistrate. I left the office and drove back to my place. The city lights were beginning to slice through the winter dark, and the cold air bleeding up through the floorboards of my worn-out work truck had a steadying effect. I turned over in my mind the sheer moral rot it takes to attempt something like that. Donovan was prepared to have his own father committed to a psychiatric ward just to hold on to his imported cars and his Bellevue Country Club membership. He was willing to erase me from the legal record to protect his lifestyle. Whatever grief I had still been carrying for the son I thought I knew burned away completely. There was nothing left worth mourning because the man I believed I had raised simply did not exist. I was a malicious liability, one that needed to be permanently liquidated. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs, unlocked my door, and sat down at the kitchen table. The red light on my security camera blinked steadily at me. This had stopped being a family dispute. It was now a fight for my survival. They had tried to cast me as a frail, bewildered old man with nothing left in him. They were about to discover that a master architect never raises a structure without engineering a way to bring it down. I drank a glass of water and got ready for the courtroom. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse were solid and unyielding. I pushed through them with Clifford walking in perfect sync beside me. The polished marble floors threw back the sound of our footsteps in sharp, heavy echoes. That sound was familiar. Decades of walking through municipal buildings had made it so. I understand how institutions are constructed. I understand how the weight of authority is distributed across a room to make people who don't grasp the architecture of power feel small. I was not here today to feel small. I was here to watch my son try to weaponize the legal system and fail completely. We made our way into this courtroom designated for emergency hearings. The air was stale and charged with nervous tension. Donovan and Petra were already seated at the petitioner's table. They had retained a man named Aldous to represent them. Aldous was a predatory family. Law attorney, expensive suits, a reputation for drowning. Elderly defendants under mountains of aggressive paperwork. He was whispering rapidly to Donovan as we settled at our table. Donovan looked up and caught my eye. He gave me a smug, patronizing smile. He was certain he was holding the winning hand. He believed the fraudulent medical document he had obtained from his country club physician was an unbreakable lock on the whole proceeding. The magistrate entered and took her seat at the high bench. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes and a well-known reputation for having zero patience with frivolous litigation. She opened the file and read out the emergency petition for temporary guardianship. She looked down at me, then across to Donovan. She asked Aldis's team to justify their attempt to strip a grown man of his fundamental autonomy. Aldis rose and smoothed the lapels of his suit. He spoke with a rehearsed theatrical sorrow. He told the magistrate this was a heartbreaking case of rapid cognitive decline. He claimed I was in the grip of aggressive early-onset dementia. He painted the portrait of a confused, paranoid father who had inexplicably turned against his devoted family. He pointed to the frozen bank accounts and the eviction notice as ironclad proof of my deterioration. He argued that no father of sound mind would cast his own son out into the winter cold. He insisted I was a danger to myself and that immediate legal intervention was needed before I dismantled my own estate. To close his argument, Aldis produced the fraudulent affidavit. He handed the document to the court clerk. He announced with evident pride that it bore the signature of Dr. Pruitt, a prominent local physician. The document certified that I lacked the executive function to manage my own finances and required immediate protective custody. Petra sat beside Donovan, pressing a tissue to her dry eyes. It was a flawless performance of suburban anguish. They had assembled a perfect narrative, a young family doing nothing more than trying to look after a sick old man. The magistrate reviewed the affidavit without a word. The courtroom went completely still. Donovan leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked over at me with an expression of total triumph. I thought the demolition was finished. He thought he had already seized my life's savings. The magistrate looked up and directed her attention to Clifford. She asked whether the respondent wished to speak before she ruled on the emergency motion. Clifford rose slowly. He had none of the frantic theatrical energy radiating from opposing counsel. He moved with the calm, unhurried precision of an apex predator closing its jaws. He buttoned his jacket and addressed the magistrate. He told her we had no intention of arguing the emotional merits of the petitioner's claims. We are only interested, he said, in the structural integrity of their evidence. Clifford crossed to the clerk's desk and asked to examine the affidavit Aldis had submitted. He studied the signature and gave a small shake of his head, a gesture of mild professional disgust. He turned back to face the magistrate. He informed the court that I had never been a patient of Dr. Pruitt's. He stated clearly for the official record that I had not seen this physician for a consultation, an examination, or so much as a brief conversation. Clifford asked the magistrate to note the exact date and time stamped on the document. It had been signed precisely 12 hours after I served Donovan and Petra with a formal 30-day eviction notice. Aldis was on his feet immediately. He shouted that we were defaming a respected medical professional. He insisted the assessment was valid and had been conducted through extensive family interviews. Clifford ignored the outburst entirely. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and drew out a thick, bound folder bearing the official seal of the State Medical University Hospital. He approached the bench and placed it directly before the magistrate. He told her we had anticipated this exact, desperate maneuver. He explained that 48 hours ago I had undergone a comprehensive, grueling cognitive and psychiatric evaluation. Haimad clear that the evaluation had not been performed by a boutique wellness doctor looking for a quick paycheck from a country club acquaintance. It had been administered by the head of the neurology department at the state's leading research hospital. The magistrate opened the folder. The silence in the room deepened until it felt heavy enough to collapse Donovan's chest from the inside. I watched her work through the detailed 20-page report. The report certified my perfect spatial reasoning. It certified my flawless memory recall. It certified my absolute unyielding mental clarity. The neurologist had explicitly concluded that I possessed full executive function and performed at a cognitive level exceptional for a man of any age. The color drained from Donovan's face entirely. His smug smile cracked and fell apart. Petra stopped pressing the tissue to her eyes and stared at the thick medical file resting on the judge's desk. In that moment, they both understood that their cheap forgery had been eclipsed by an unassailable body of legitimate scientific evidence. The magistrate set down the folder and fixed her gaze on Aldous. Her eyes were hard and without mercy. She asked the attorney to explain how his client had obtained a diagnosis of severe dementia from a doctor who had never once physically examined the patient, while the state's leading neurologist had simultaneously certified that same patient as perfectly healthy. Aldous faltered. The smooth, arrogant rhythm of his voice vanished entirely. He looked to Donovan for some explanation, but Donovan was staring blankly at the floor. Aldous tried to retreat. He stammered that his clients had acted in good faith, guided by the behavioral changes they had personally observed. He attempted to frame the eviction notice as the source of genuine concern for my well-being. The magistrate cut him off sharply. Her voice rang through the marble courtroom. She stated that the petition was not an expression of family concern. She declared it a transparent and malicious attempt to retaliate against a lawful eviction. She noted the highly suspicious timing of the medical claim, pointing out that the sudden alarm over my mental health had only surfaced the moment their free housing and misappropriated money were revoked. She looked down at Donovan and Petra. She told them she found their conduct deeply disturbing. She stated that attempting to weaponize the guardianship system to circumvent a legal eviction was a severe abuse of the judicial process. She informed them that submitting an unverified medical document to seize control of another person's assets bordered on criminal fraud. The magistrate announced that the emergency petition for guardianship was dismissed with prejudice. She ordered explicitly that no further petitions of this nature could be brought without a court-appointed independent medical examiner. She then looked directly at Aldous and suggested he advise his clients to begin preparing for the serious legal consequences of filing a fraudulent affidavit under oath. The hearing was over. The counterstrike had been executed with precision. We hadn't merely held the fortress, we had smashed their siege engines and sent their forces scattering. Clifford packed his briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. Aldous did not linger. He crammed his papers together frantically and rushed out of the courtroom, abandoning his clients at the table. He understood that their lies had just done serious damage to his reputation, and he needed to put distance between himself and the wreckage that was coming. I rose, buttoned my coat, and looked across the room at my son. Donovan was shaking. His hands had the edge of the table in a white-knuckled grip. He was pulling air in short, shallow bursts. The full weight of his total defeat was finally closing around him. He had thrown his last card on the table. He had tried to erase my legal existence, and he had failed publicly, catastrophically, and on the record. Petra didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, her face locked in rigid shock. The Bellevue Country Club connections had been useless to her. Her contempt for my intelligence had been her undoing. They had just over 3 weeks remaining in that house, and no access whatsoever to the money they would need to find another one. I walked past their table without a single word. There was nothing left to say. The emotional bond had been cut away long before this day, and now the legal bond was officially severed as well. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped back out into the freezing winter morning. The air hit me sharp and clean. Clifford fell into step beside me, his predatory instincts fully satisfied by the completeness of what had just happened inside. We moved toward the parking lot without speaking. The second phase of the demolition was finished. The house was secured. My autonomy was absolute, but the foundational crimes were still out there unpunished and waiting. The $1,500 drained every month from a dying woman's medical fund. The $45,000 fraudulent credit line to build a luxury patio. The civil matters were resolved, but the criminal liabilities were ripe for the next move. I unlocked my worn-out work truck and got in. I looked at Clifford standing on the frozen pavement and told him it was time to move into the final phase. It was time to place the forged signature and the audio recordings of their violent threats directly in the hands of the federal authorities. Clifford nodded. The mask had slipped. The trap had snapped shut. And now the crushing machinery of the law was about to come down squarely on my son's shoulders. I turned the ignition and pulled away from the courthouse, leaving the wreckage of Donovan's arrogance behind me. The family court victory had been a structural clearing, nothing more. We had stripped away the debris of their fraudulent medical claims, but the foundational theft was still unresolved. The $45,000 fraudulent credit line was a loaded weapon sitting on the table. Donovan had forged my signature to obtain those funds. Clifford and I sat in his corner office and watched the snow press itself against the glass. I told him I had no interest in a quiet settlement. I wanted the federal authorities to take Donovan apart completely. Clifford poured a glass of water and laid out the final maneuver. We needed Donovan to commit a federal crime on camera in front of witnesses. Clifford drafted a settlement offer. It was a masterpiece of legal bait. The document stated that I would halt the eviction and legally forgive the stolen hospice funds provided Donovan signed a sworn admission acknowledging that he had opened the $45,000 credit line without my knowledge or consent and agreed to a strict repayment schedule. Clifford emailed the proposal to Aldous. Aldous immediately forwarded the document to his client and formally withdrew as their legal counsel. The family court disaster had rattled him badly. Donovan was now completely exposed without a single layer of legal protection between him and what was coming. I sat in my apartment watching the security feed from my hidden cameras. I knew Donovan could never sign that admission. A sworn acknowledgement of unauthorized credit extension was a written confession to wire fraud. But refusing the settlement meant he would be physically removed from that house in 20 days. He was pressed hard against a concrete wall with no room to maneuver. He had no money to retain new counsel. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for catastrophic mistakes. 2 days passed without a sound. On the morning of January 8th, my phone buzzed. It was a direct message from Donovan. He said he was ready to settle the dispute. He asked for a meeting at Clifford's office that afternoon. He said he had a counter-proposal that would resolve the financial issues without requiring him to confess to any criminal liability. I called Clifford and told him to activate every recording device in the building. The prey was walking straight into the facility. I arrived at the law firm an hour early. Clifford and I checked the audio feeds and confirmed the cloud storage connection was live. The cameras were completely out of sight, tucked inside smoke detectors, and concealed behind the thick spines of the legal encyclopedia on the bookshelf. Every word spoken in that room was going to become permanent federal evidence. At precisely 3:00, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. Donovan walked in wearing a wrinkled suit. The arrogant posture I had watched him carry for years was gone, entirely replaced by a nervous, sweating energy. I wasn't alone. Beside him walked a thin man with a worn leather briefcase. The man had on a cheap gray suit and kept his eyes away from the receptionist. I knew right away he was not a lawyer. A legitimate attorney enters a room with presence. This man moved like something scurrying along the baseboards. Clifford brought them into the corner office and closed the door. The soundproofing swallowed the city noise outside and left the room completely still. I sat across the mahogany desk and looked at my son. His eyes were bloodshot. He carried the faint smell of stale alcohol and cheap cologne. He didn't look at me. He fixed his gaze on Clifford and announced that he was rejecting our settlement offer. Clifford leaned back in his leather chair and asked Donovan how exactly he planned to stop the eviction and address the $45,000 fraud investigation without signing the agreement. Donovan smirked. It was a weak, trembling shadow of the arrogance he used to wear comfortably. He told Clifford there was no fraud investigation because there had been no fraud. He claimed I had voluntarily granted him complete financial authority over all my accounts a year ago. He said he had the legal documentation to prove it. He turned toward the thin man seated beside him. Donovan introduced him as Reuben. He described Reuben as an independent notary public and private financial auditor. Reuben opened his worn leather briefcase and placed a single sheet of heavy paper on Clifford's desk. He slid it across the polished wood surface. I looked down at the page. It was a general power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Donovan total control over my banking profiles, my credit lines, and my corporate assets. The language stated I had authorized him to execute loans and manage my estate due to my declining health. The date stamped at the top of the page was exactly 14 months ago. At the bottom was my signature. It was the exact same sloppy, erratic forgery I had already seen on the bank loan application. The loops ran too wide, and the pen pressure was completely inconsistent throughout. Alongside the forged signature sat a blue notary stamp bearing Reuben's name, confirming he had personally witnessed me execute the document 14 months prior. The audacity of the move was breathtaking. Donovan had concluded he couldn't outrun the forgery charge, so he had decided to double down instead. He had retained a black market document forger to construct a retroactive legal shield. He believed this fabricated power of attorney would retroactively legitimize the stolen credit line and force me to abandon the eviction. Clifford picked up the document and studied it with absolute professional detachment. He looked at Reuben. He asked Reuben directly whether he held a valid notary license in this state. Reuben swallowed and nodded. He said his license was current. Clifford asked him to confirm for the record that he had been physically present in that room 14 months ago and had personally witnessed me sign the power of attorney. Reuben glanced at Donovan. Donovan gave him a sharp, desperate nod. Reuben turned back to Clifford and stated clearly that he had personally verified my identification and watched me put my signature on the paper on that exact date. The air in the room went cold in an instant. The trap had snapped completely shut. Clifford set the forged document gently back on the desk. He laced his fingers together and looked at Reuben. He asked Reuben whether he understood the federal penalties for forging a legal instrument used to conceal bank fraud. Reuben shifted in his chair. He stammered that he was only a notary and the document was entirely legitimate. I leaned forward and spoke for the first time since they had come through the door. I told Reuben that 14 months ago I was standing on steel scaffolding in a neighboring state, overseeing the emergency reinforcement of a commercial bridge. I explained that I had been surrounded by 40 union steel workers and a team of county inspectors for 14 consecutive hours on the exact date printed on his fraudulent document. I told him I had the payroll records, hotel receipts, and government inspection logs to place my location beyond any doubt. The blood drained out of Reuben's face entirely. He looked down at his cheap shoes, then toward the door. He understood that he had just walked into a fatal ambush. Clifford didn't give them a single second to find their footing. He pointed a finger at Reuben and laid out the exact reality of what was happening. He told the forger that producing a fabricated legal instrument to extort a settlement and conceal a federal banking crime was a serious felony. He stated that conspiracy to commit wire fraud carried a minimum mandatory sentence in a federal penitentiary. Clifford then tilted his head toward the ceiling and addressed the hidden microphones directly. He stated for the record that the entire exchange had just been captured in high-definition audio and video. He informed them that the footage was at that moment sitting on a secure server accessible only to the federal authorities. Donovan exploded out of his chair. The legs scraped hard against the floor. He lunged across the desk, reaching for the forged power of attorney. Pure blind panic was driving him. He wanted to destroy the physical evidence before it could be used against him. I was on my feet instantly. I caught his wrist before his fingers made contact with the paper. My hands had spent 40 years wrapped around steel cables and heavy iron bolts. I locked his arm in place with a grip like a vice. Donovan gasped in pain and dropped to his knees. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I looked down at the son, who had left me locked outside in the freezing rain. I looked at the man who had stolen money set aside to ease his dying mother's suffering. I told him the game was permanently over. I told him there were no more forged documents to buy and no more doctors left to bribe. He had just committed a federal crime inside a law firm while surrounded on all sides by surveillance cameras. Reuben didn't wait to be dismissed. He scrambled out of his chair, left his leather briefcase on the floor, and bolted through the heavy glass doors of the office. He ran down the hallway, desperate to get clear of the blast radius of my son's catastrophic failure. Clifford made no move to stop him. The briefcase sitting on the floor contained all of Reuben's forging equipment and notary logs. The authorities would have him within hours. I released Donovan's wrist. He collapsed backward onto the carpet, clutching his arm against his chest. He began to hyperventilate. The immaculate suburban facade had finally burned away completely, leaving nothing behind but a desperate criminal sitting on the floor of a law firm. He begged me to delete the footage. He promised he would pack his things and clear out of the house that very night. He swore he would never come near me again if I would just let him walk away. I moved around the desk and picked up the forged document. I folded it carefully and placed it inside my coat pocket. I looked down at the broken man weeping on the carpet. I told him I was not going to delete a single frame. I explained that an architect does not halt a demolition simply because the structure pleads for mercy. The building was corrupt from the foundation up, and the charges had already been detonated. Clifford lifted his office phone and dialed a direct number. He asked to be connected to the federal prosecutor assigned to financial crimes. The civil dispute had officially ended. The criminal prosecution had begun. I walked out of the corner office, leaving my son on the floor as the weight of the federal government began descending on him. The extraction was complete. The disease had been cut entirely out of my life. I stepped out into the frozen city streets and let the cold air fill my lungs. The sky was clear, the horizon wide open and unobstructed. The drive away from the law firm felt nothing like the journey there. The winter air pressing through the vents of my worn-out work truck no longer felt bitter or biting. It felt like something being washed clean. The architecture of my son's deception had been completely hollowed out. There was no foundation remaining to support the weight of his arrogance. Clifford had made the call to the federal prosecutor, but the full truth of what had just happened ran far deeper than a single phone call. We had not stumbled into a lucky break with the notary. Reuben had never been a genuine threat to my autonomy. He was a demolition charge that had been placed by the authorities long before Donovan ever walked him through the doors of Clifford's office. Clifford had known exactly who Reuben was the moment he slid that forged document across the mahogany desk. The federal authorities had spent over 8 months tracking a sophisticated document fraud ring operating throughout the city. Reuben had been caught earlier in the year forging commercial real estate deeds. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary, he had agreed to become an active informant. He wore a concealed recording device to every meeting. He documented every illicit transaction. When Donovan went searching for a black market professional to fabricate my medical records and power of attorney, he unknowingly put himself in the hands of a man working directly for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The mechanics of Reuben's cooperation with the federal government were a masterpiece of legal engineering. When Donovan first went looking for a forger, he reached out to a shady contractor he had used before for unpermitted remodeling work. That man handed him a prepaid phone number. Donovan thought he was being extraordinarily careful. He believed he was moving through the deep shadows of the criminal underworld. In reality, he was dialing straight into a federal switchboard. Reuben had been instructed by his handlers to agree to every request Donovan made. When Donovan asked for a backdated power of attorney, Reuben obliged without hesitation. When Petra demanded a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation bearing the signature of a compromised physician, Reuben delivered the document without blinking. The federal agents had told Reuben to let my son's arrogance set the pace of the operation. They understood that entitled people rarely recognize danger because they are convinced the rules simply don't reach them. The $50,000 Donovan wired to Reuben to secure those fabricated documents was the final nail in his coffin. He didn't use cash. He used the fraudulent $45,000 credit line he had opened in my name, moving the money through digital banking applications across state lines. That single action triggered the federal wire fraud statutes. It transformed a local elder abuse case into a major federal prosecution built around the digital transmission of stolen funds. The federal agents traced the money's digital footprint as it moved from the bank server directly into evidence accounts controlled by the Bureau. The chain of custody was flawless. Every panicked phone call Donovan made to coordinate the forgery had been captured. Every demand Petra issued to speed up the fake psychiatric evaluation had been logged and transcribed by federal agents. Between the two of them, they had essentially produced their own documentary of their criminal conspiracy. The meeting in Clifford's office was simply the final piece of corroborating evidence the prosecutor needed to execute the warrants. The hammer came down 48 hours later. It was a bitterly cold Thursday morning. The neighborhood where Donovan and Petra lived was quiet and perfectly still. The manicured lawns lay buried beneath an unbroken blanket of white snow. The residents of the gated community were drinking their expensive coffee and easing into another comfortable morning. That pristine calm was shattered at precisely 6:00 a.m. I didn't need to be there to witness it. Clifford gave me the full account later that afternoon. 3 dark SUVs swung into the wide circular driveway of the Craftsman house. A dozen federal agents in heavy tactical vests stepped out onto the frozen pavement. They did not knock. They did not wait for Petra to pull on her designer clothes. They put a steel ram through the front door. The sound carried through the entire subdivision, jolting neighbors awake and setting off a wave of security alarms. Donovan was pulled from his bed. The man who had spent 4 years treating me as a disposable asset was made to stand in his grand foyer in his sleepwear. His hands were secured behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. Petra was escorted down the sweeping staircase by two female agents. Every trace of the carefully constructed image of suburban superiority she had maintained was gone in an instant. She was weeping without restraint as the agents read through the list of charges. The neighbors gathered on their porches and pressed their faces to their windows as the golden couple of the neighborhood was walked out into the freezing cold. The charges the federal agents recited were extensive and absolutely devastating. Conspiracy to commit medical document fraud, aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, attempted extortion. The $50,000 they had paid. The informant pushed the charges to a level that guaranteed a lengthy mandatory sentence. They were loaded into the back of federal vehicles and driven away from the property they had worked so ruthlessly to steal. The agents didn't stop at arresting my son and his wife. They executed a full asset seizure. The imported luxury vehicles sitting in the garage were impounded. The expensive furniture and artwork throughout the house were cataloged and frozen by the authorities as proceeds of financial crimes. The house itself remained untouched only because my corporate entity held the clean legal deed. Every single thing Donovan and Petra had claimed to own was stripped away within hours. The parasitic growth had been cut entirely from the host. By noon, the local news networks were running the details of the raid. The story of a prominent suburban couple conspiring to have an elderly father declared mentally incompetent in order to seize his life savings was too sensational to pass up. Petra lost her position at the corporate firm before the sun went down. Her partners severed all ties immediately to avoid the toxic fallout. Donovan was barred from the Bellevue Country Club the moment his mugshot appeared on the television screens in their private lounge. The social ecosystem they had sacrificed everything to enter rejected them instantly and permanently. I sat in my small apartment above the laundromat and watched the news coverage on my small television. I watched the helicopter footage of the federal vehicles lined up in the driveway of the house I had purchased. I watched reporters standing in the snow, laying out the precise mechanics of the fraud. I felt no pity. Pity is an emotion reserved for people who meet tragedy by chance. This was not a tragedy. This was a mathematical certainty. You cannot raise a heavy structure on a foundation of rotting wood and then act surprised when the whole thing gives way. Clifford called me later that evening. He told me bail had been denied. The federal magistrate considered Donovan and Petra a serious flight risk, given their demonstrated willingness to fabricate legal documents and steal substantial sums of money. They would remain in federal custody until their trial. Clifford informed me their assigned public defenders had already reached out looking to negotiate a plea deal. They wanted to limit the prison time. Clifford advised me the prosecutor had no intention of offering leniency. The evidence was too complete and the crime too repugnant. I thought about the sheer vanity required to execute such a poorly constructed plan. Donovan and Petra had spent their entire adult lives drawing on my quiet financial support to prop up their illusion of success. They had grown so accustomed to my silent compliance that they had forgotten entirely what I was. They forgot I was an engineer. They forgot I had spent 4 decades designing structures built to endure hurricanes and earthquakes. They came at me with cheap paper and sloppy lies. They brought a sledgehammer to break down a titanium vault. Now they were standing in the path of the federal justice system's full machinery. The prosecutors would methodically dismantle every corner of their lives. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, the carefully maintained social standing. All of it was gone for good. They would spend the next decade inside a federal facility, reflecting on the precise moment they decided to lock an old man out in the freezing rain. The controlled demolition was finished. The dust had settled, and the site was completely cleared. The son who had left me shivering on the front step to protect his lifestyle was now locked inside a concrete cell. The woman who had ridiculed my worn clothes was wearing a standard-issue prison uniform. Every dollar they had siphoned from my late wife's hospice fund would be extracted from them painfully through years of federal restitution orders. I switched off the television and moved into my quiet kitchen. I poured a glass of cold water and stood at the window looking out over the dark city. The winter storm had passed at last. The sky had opened up and the stars were clearly visible above the skyline. The structural integrity of my life was fully restored. The blueprints were clean. The foundation was solid steel. I drank the water and sat with the absolute unbroken silence. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but the mechanisms of corporate finance move with a different kind of speed entirely. The moment the federal agents froze the offshore accounts and seized the physical assets, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the suburban house. Donovan had not made a legitimate mortgage payment in 6 months. He had been sustaining the appearance of ownership entirely through fraudulent credit lines, and money bled from my accounts. When Clifford delivered verified evidence of wire fraud to the loan officers, the bank immediately voided whatever grace periods remained. The eviction notice was no longer a family matter. It was a binding directive from a major financial institution. The bank's executives saw the federal indictments pending against my son and recognized that their collateral was in serious jeopardy. They moved to reclaim the property with ruthless corporate efficiency. The morning of the eviction was brutally cold. The sky sat low and gray, a solid sheet of steel that matched the absolute finality of the day. Winter frost gripped the manicured lawns of the subdivision like a heavy, suffocating weight. I parked my worn-out work truck halfway down the street from the Craftsman house. The neighborhood was fully awake. The residents of the gated community had positioned themselves on their porches and behind their bay windows. The suburban ecosystem demands the appearance of success and expels without hesitation anyone who fractures that illusion. Donovan and Petra were no longer the golden couple of the neighborhood. They were a contagion, and the community had assembled to observe the quarantine. People who had happily accepted invitations to their lavish dinner parties now stood with crossed arms, murmuring to one another. The social currency Petra had bought with my stolen money was completely worthless. 2 heavy white vans from the county sheriff's department pulled into the wide circular driveway. 4 deputies climbed out onto the frozen concrete. They moved without anger or malice. They moved with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of men who carry out evictions every day of the working week. They climbed the front steps and pounded on the heavy oak door. The sound carried down the quiet street and cut through the freezing wind. The bank had formally taken possession of the property. Every piece of expensive furniture, every designer garment, every luxury appliance inside that house was now frozen collateral tied to the federal fraud investigation. Donovan and Petra were permitted to leave with only the clothes on their backs and whatever personal items fit inside a single standard cardboard box. The life they had assembled on a foundation of theft was being itemized and claimed by the state. The front door opened, and the deputies entered the grand foyer. 20 minutes passed in tense, complete silence. The neighbors pulled their expensive coats tighter against the freezing wind, unwilling to look away. Then Petra appeared in the doorway. She looked entirely unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant woman who had mocked my faded canvas work shirts and treated my compliance as something owed to her was completely gone. She had on plain gray sweatpants and a heavy winter jacket. Her face was pale, stripped bare of the expensive makeup she had always worn as armor. She held a small brown box pressed tightly to her chest. She descended the long brick path with her head down, eyes fixed on the frozen ground below her. She didn't look at the deputies positioned on the porch. She didn't glance at the neighbors watching from their lawns. She moved like a hollow ghost, drifting through the wreckage of a life she no longer recognized. Donovan followed a few moments behind her. A tall deputy stayed close at his back, making certain he didn't pause or try to step back inside the property. Donovan carried nothing. His hands were empty, buried deep in his coat pockets. He had on an old dark jacket and heavy work boots. His posture was entirely broken. The broad shoulders he had always used to project authority and intimidate his way through rooms were hunched sharply forward. The combined pressure of federal indictments, a collapsed career, and complete public disgrace had caved him in. He caught the bottom step wrong and stumbled. The deputy made no move to steady him. The officer simply raised a gloved finger toward the street, directing him to leave the premises immediately and permanently. I stood on the sidewalk beside the frozen trunk of an old elm tree. My hands rested quietly in my coat pockets. I didn't move as they came slowly down the long driveway. I watched the structural collapse reach its absolute final conclusion. Donovan raised his head and found me standing there in the cold. His bloodshot eyes locked onto my face. He stopped walking. The deputy behind him told him to keep moving, but Donovan planted his boots on the concrete. He stared at me with an expression of pure, agonizing clarity. He understood in that exact moment that this was not a streak of bad luck or a temporary reversal. He grasped that every terrible thing now bearing down on him was the direct mathematical result of his own choices. He had tried to pull the foundation out from under me, and in doing so, he had demolished his own world entirely. He took a hesitant step in my direction. He opened his mouth to speak. I have no idea what he intended to say. I don't know whether he wanted to beg for somewhere to sleep or hurl his final resentments into the winter air. It made no difference. No, I didn't offer a single word of comfort. I didn't offer a single word of condemnation or rage. I looked at the boy. I had raised the man who had been perfectly willing to have me committed to a psychiatric ward for a few $1,000s, and I gave him absolutely nothing. The silence between us was a wall of solid steel. I am an engineer. I know precisely how much load a bearing beam can carry before it fractures under the stress. I had been carrying the weight of his entitlement and his cruelty for decades. I had absorbed the financial blows and the emotional neglect, believing that a solid enough foundation might eventually stabilize even a warped structure. But the beam had finally given way. There was nothing left worth repairing. A bridge that has fallen into the river cannot simply be wished back into place. It has to be cleared so the water can move freely again. Donovan read the absolute finality in my eyes. Whatever last pathetic ember of defiance remained in him went out entirely. He closed his mouth and dropped his head. He turned away from me and walked slowly down the street, trailing his weeping wife into the biting wind. They had no vehicles left to drive. There was no money tucked away in private accounts. There were no friends remaining at this prestigious country club who would dare answer their calls. They were walking toward a public bus stop on the outer edge of the subdivision, beginning a long and terrifying journey into the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. I turned my attention back to the property. The deputies had completed their thorough sweep of the interior. A bank representative came up the driveway carrying a heavy metal lockbox and a thick steel chain. He secured the front doors and fixed the lockbox to the polished brass handle. He drove a bright yellow foreclosure notice into the frozen earth beside the brick mailbox. The legal warning shuddered in the cold wind. The house was no longer a symbol of stolen wealth or suburban superiority. It was an empty, dark shell waiting to be liquidated to service their enormous fraudulent debts. The neighbors began to drift away, retreating to the warmth of their secure and legitimately held homes. The spectacle was over. The subdivision had successfully expelled the financial infection from its streets. I stood on the sidewalk a few moments longer, listening to the wind move through the bare branches of the tall elm trees. The natural order had been fully restored. The parasites had been cleanly removed, and the host had survived the extraction intact. I walked back to my worn-out work truck and settled into the cold cabin. I started the engine and pushed the heater to full, letting the warm air work through my frozen fingers. I thought about the detailed legal files sitting on Clifford's mahogany desk. I thought about the federal prosecutors assembling the wire fraud and conspiracy indictments. The criminal machinery would continue grinding forward without requiring my direct involvement. My quiet, necessary work in the shadows was officially complete. I put the truck in gear and drove slowly out through the gates of the community. I did not check the rearview mirror as I turned the corner. I left the Craftsman house and the yellow foreclosure notice completely behind me. I drove back toward the city, back toward my small, quiet apartment above the laundromat. It was modest and cramped, but it stood on a foundation of absolute truth and honest labor. I had protected my legacy and reclaimed my personal honor. I watched the gray city skyline come up through the windshield, entirely satisfied by the beautiful, unyielding mathematics of justice. The state criminal courthouse was built from heavy blocks of gray limestone. It was designed to resemble a fortress of absolute accountability. I walked up the wide concrete steps with Clifford at my side. The winter wind had finally dropped away, leaving the morning air completely still and bitterly cold. I have spent my entire life evaluating the structural integrity of massive buildings. I know that a courthouse must feel immovably heavy. It must communicate to the guilty that the walls surrounding them cannot be manipulated. Donovan and Petra had spent their lives bending every environment they moved through to their advantage. Today, they were entering a structure they could not control. We took our seats in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecutor's table. The courtroom was lined with dark wood and lit by sterile fluorescent light. A heavy side door opened, and 2 county bailiffs escorted my son and his wife into the room. I looked at the 2 people who had tried to erase my legal existence. Every piece of armor they had purchased was gone. Donovan wore a loose orange custody uniform that swallowed his frame entirely. His broad shoulders were rounded and defeated. He shuffled across the linoleum floor, eyes fixed blankly on the polished wooden surface of the defense table. Petra followed close behind him. The woman who had once stood in my cramped kitchen ridiculing my worn clothes was now draped in the exact same cheap orange fabric as her husband. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her face was completely drained of color. The Bellevue Country Club socialite had been reduced to a state inmate. They sat at the defense table in complete silence. They didn't turn to face the gallery. They didn't scan the room for support, because they knew there was none left to find. The friends they had purchased with my stolen money had abandoned them the instant the federal indictments became public. The judge entered and took his position at the high bench. He was a seasoned jurist with a reputation for merciless efficiency. The trial was to be swift. No lengthy theatrical performance was needed because the evidence was absolutely irrefutable. The lead prosecutor rose and addressed the court. She didn't raise her voice or manufacture false emotion. She simply laid out the chronological architecture of their crimes. She explained how Donovan and Petra had drained a dying woman's medical fund to finance their luxury lifestyle. She detailed the $45,000 fraudulent credit line used to build a patio. The defense attorney attempted to interrupt. He tried to introduce a narrative of financial desperation. He argued his clients had been overwhelmed by the mounting costs of suburban life and made poor, impulsive decisions under severe pressure. The prosecutor dismantled that defense immediately. She stated that desperation does not account for premeditated conspiracy. She produced banking documenting the exact moment Donovan transferred $50,000 of stolen funds to a known federal informant. She laid out how that money had been used to procure a fabricated psychiatric evaluation and a forged power of attorney. The prosecutor pointed directly at Donovan and stated that these were not impulsive choices. They were calculated steps designed to have a perfectly sane man imprisoned. The prosecution then played the audio recordings captured by the hidden cameras inside Clifford's office. The voices of my son and his wife filled the silent courtroom. The judge listened as Donovan confidently presented the forged documents. He listened as Petra demanded the eviction be suspended in exchange for my physical freedom. The malice embedded in their voices was amplified by the room's sterile acoustics. Reading a transcript of a crime is one thing entirely. Hearing the raw, unvarnished arrogance of two people methodically working to destroy a family member for financial gain is something else altogether. The defense attorney lowered his head and stopped taking notes. He knew the structural integrity of his case had buckled completely under the weight of the audio evidence. The prosecutor called me to the witness stand. I walked past the defense table without glancing at Donovan or Petra. I took my seat and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe the events of Christmas Eve. I sat in the wooden chair and spoke with absolute mechanical precision. I recounted standing on their porch in the freezing rain. I described how my son looked me in the eye and turned the deadbolt on the front door to shield his holiday party from the embarrassment of my presence. I told the court how they later tried to weaponize that exact moment of cruelty as fabricated evidence of my mental decline. I recalled a summer afternoon many decades back when Donovan was still a young boy. I had brought him to the construction site to teach him how to pour a concrete foundation. I told him that day that a single critical flaw at the base of any structure will eventually bring the whole thing down. I told him that gravity has no patience for a lie. He hadn't listened then, and he had spent the whole of his adult life trying to defy that simple truth. I looked at the judge and stated plainly that my son had built his entire existence on a foundation of theft and manipulation. I made clear that I took no pleasure in his ruin, but I would not allow him to use my life as raw material for his own survival. The defense attorney chose not to cross-examine me. There were no gaps in my testimony worth pursuing. I was dismissed from the stand and returned to my seat beside Clifford. The trial moved swiftly toward its inevitable end. The prosecution rested, and the defense offered no witnesses. They had nothing left to bring forward. The fraudulent medical documents, the forged power of attorney, and the recorded extortion attempts had formed an inescapable steel cage around the defendants. The judge did not need a lengthy deliberation. He looked down at the documents spread across his bench, then fixed his gaze squarely on Donovan and Petra. The courtroom was so still I could make out the faint hum of the heating vents. The judge stated that in his 30 years on the bench, he had rarely encountered a case of elder abuse so thoroughly documented and so deliberately malicious. He addressed Petra first. He told her that draining the medical funds of a dying woman to bankroll a country club lifestyle was an act of profound moral depravity. He then turned his attention to Donovan. He told my son that attempting to confine his own father inside a psychiatric facility using forged documents was a crime that violated the most basic principles of human decency. He stated that the legal system rests on the assumption of truth, and that corrupting it with fabricated medical records is a direct assault on the court itself. The judge announced that he found them both guilty on all counts of conspiracy wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The sentencing was immediate and without mercy. The judge sentenced Petra to 7 years in the state penitentiary. He then sentenced Donovan to 12 years in state prison. He ordered full restitution for every dollar stolen, including the medical funds and the fraudulent credit lines. He mandated that their remaining liquidated assets be transferred directly to my corporate entity to satisfy the debts. The heavy wooden gavel came down on the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack. That sound marked the absolute end of their privileged existence. The bailiffs stepped forward and directed Donovan and Petra to rise. Petra began to weep silently as the steel cuffs were locked around her wrists. She was led away through the side door without once looking back. Donovan got to his feet slowly. His face had gone completely hollow. He looked at me one last time across that sterile room. The arrogance had drained entirely from his posture. The anger was gone too. What remained was only the bare realization that he was about to spend the next decade of his life inside a concrete cell. He was escorted out, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him. Clifford closed his briefcase and gave me a single nod. The operation was fully complete. The corrupted components had been removed from the structural framework of my life. I stood and walked out of the courtroom. The thick limestone walls of the building felt right somehow. Justice is at its core a matter of correct engineering. When you apply the proper pressure to a corrupt element, it eventually fractures and leaves the sound material standing. I descended the wide concrete steps and walked out into a bright winter afternoon. The gray clouds had broken apart entirely, leaving a clean blue sky stretched wide above the city skyline. The cold air hit my lungs and felt remarkably pure. I walked toward my truck at the curb. I carried no residual sorrow. What I felt was the quiet, deep satisfaction of a man who has successfully restored the natural order. I unlocked the door and turned the engine over. The road ahead was entirely clear and the foundation was finally solid. Winter eventually yielded, giving way to the slow, deliberate thaw of early spring. I have always valued the changing of the seasons because they mirror the necessary phases of any construction project. Winter is for pouring concrete, letting the cold cure the foundation into an unbreakable slab. Spring is for raising the steel frame. My life had just endured a brutal winter of demolition and excavation. The diseased structure of my family had been stripped down to bare bedrock. Now it was time to build something entirely new on the cleared ground. The first order of business was the total liquidation of the suburban house. The bank had moved forward with foreclosure on Donovan's fraudulent debts, but my corporate entity held the master deed. Clifford and his team worked with methodical precision to untangle the property from the federal criminal proceedings. The process demanded weeks of heavy legal filings and negotiations with bank executives who were pressing hard to recover their losses. Clifford applied exactly the pressure required, using the federal indictments against my son as leverage to accelerate the clearance. Once the federal prosecutors formally released the physical asset, I instructed Clifford to list the property on the open market without delay. I had no desire to hold ownership of a structure that had housed so much deceit. A building absorbs the character of the people inside it, and that house was saturated with vanity and entitlement. I drove out to the property one final time before the real estate brokers arrived. The neighborhood was quiet, and the manicured lawns were beginning to show a vivid green beneath the morning sun. I pulled my truck into the empty circular driveway and let myself in through the heavy oak front door. The interior was completely bare. The federal authorities and the bank liquidators had stripped out every piece of expensive furniture, every imported rug, and every crystal fixture that Petra had bought with my stolen money. My footsteps echoed through the grand foyer. The house had been reduced to its most elemental geometry. Wood drywall, glass, and steel. I moved through the empty rooms, checking the load-bearing walls and the structural supports. Without its superficial layers of luxury, the house was simply a functional arrangement of angles and corridors. I stood in the center of the vast living room, where Petra had once screamed at me, and where Donovan had threatened to have me committed to a psychiatric ward. No ghosts lingered in the corners. There was only empty space and the smell of fresh paint the bank contractors had applied. I felt a profound sense of closure. The physical space had been cleansed of their infection. I locked the front door for the very last time and handed the keys to the broker waiting on the sidewalk. The house sold within 14 days. The real estate market in that exclusive gated community was fiercely competitive, and the property was picked up by a young physician and his wife. They paid in cash. Clifford closed the transaction and wired the full proceeds directly into my primary offshore accounts. I sat at the small wooden table in my apartment and watched the digital numbers accumulate on the screen. The transaction was mathematically perfect. The final connection to my former life had been officially severed and converted to capital. I felt no surge of greed when the funds were deposited. I am not a man who measures his worth by the balance on a bank ledger. To me, money is simply a structural material, the steel rebar that reinforces the concrete of personal autonomy. For decades, I had let my son draw that material away, steadily weakening my own foundation to prop up his towering delusions. I had compromised my own security to construct a life for a boy who ultimately regarded me as nothing more than a disposable resource. That financial vulnerability was now permanently erased. The substantial influx of capital from the house sale guaranteed that I would never again be placed in a position of dependence. I held total, absolute control over my medical care, my living arrangements, and my daily existence. No more anxious calculations about covering basic necessities while my son drove imported cars. No more quiet sacrifices made in the shadow of his arrogance. The money sat inside a heavily encrypted digital vault serving as an impenetrable wall between me and the wider world. It produced a steady passive income that covered my modest needs with complete certainty. I decided to stay on in my small apartment above the laundromat. Clifford had suggested I buy a comfortable condominium in a secure luxury building, but I declined. I have never needed a great deal of space to feel at ease. A master architect understands that efficiency will always outperform excess. My apartment was compact and purely functional. The floorboards were worn, and the windows shuddered when the wind moved through the downtown streets. But it was entirely mine. Nobody ever knocked on my door asking for money. Nobody ever walked into my kitchen to pass judgment on my faded canvas work shirts or complain about the smell of my coffee. My daily routine became a quiet masterpiece of uninterrupted silence. I rose at 5 Hujra in the morning and brewed a single cup of dark coffee. I settled by the window and watched the city come alive as the sun crept up over the industrial district. My mornings were given over to drafting new architectural blueprints purely for the intellectual exercise. I worked out complex suspension bridges and intricate high-rise support structures at my drafting table, letting the clean logic of mathematics fill my mind. There were no emotional variables to account for, no unpredictable human elements to throw off the equations. I found a deep beauty in the rigid laws of physics. In the afternoons, I walked over to the public library or settled into a quiet corner booth at a neighborhood diner. I watched the people around me with a detached and unhurried curiosity. Families bickering over small grievances, parents worn ragged by the relentless demands of ungrateful children. I observed them straining under the heavy invisible chains of biological obligation. I had worn those same chains for 45 years. I knew precisely how the metal scored the skin and how the cumulative weight slowly bent the spine. Watching them now from a distance, I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. Those chains had been broken, and I was completely free. Society places an outsized, irrational weight on the concept of bloodline. People are taught to believe that shared genetic material automatically produces loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. It is a deeply flawed premise. Biology is nothing more than a starting point. Raw, unrefined material. Character is constructed through decisions, conduct, and sustained integrity. Donovan carried my genetic material, but he carried none of my character. He was a defective product of his own vanity and his own unchecked greed. I no longer regarded him as my son. I thought of him as a failed experiment. The 12-year sentence he was serving in the state penitentiary was not a tragedy to be mourned. It was the correct mathematical output of every variable he had fed into the equation. He had tried to bypass the necessary labor of life by stealing the results. The universe inevitably corrects those errors. Petra was serving her 7 years in a separate facility, stripped of her Bellevue Country Club standing and her surface-level pride. They were precisely where they belonged, fully contained by a system built to address extreme structural failure. I did not feel lonely in my solitude. Loneliness is the ache produced by the gap between the connection you anticipate and the connection you actually receive. I no longer anticipated any connection. I had accepted the absolute truth of my situation. I was a solitary structure standing on its own against the elements. I did not need external validation or the warmth of family to hold my integrity together. I found genuine comfort in the predictability of my days and the complete stillness of my evenings. Every choice I made was governed solely by my own preferences. The natural order of my world was fully restored. For years, the equilibrium had been violently skewed by the parasitic demands of an ungrateful bloodline. The scale had at last been leveled. I had put the cold, unyielding machinery of the law to work, crushing a rebellion that ran entirely on arrogance. I had not resorted to shouting or to physical force. I had simply stepped aside and let the full weight of their own actions come down on them. I walked to the sink and rinsed my coffee cup, drying it with slow, deliberate care. The apartment was perfectly still. The security cameras I had mounted months earlier were still running their small red lights, blinking steadily, but they no longer stood as a defensive perimeter against an approaching threat. They were simply quiet witnesses to a peaceful routine. The war was definitively over. The final blueprint had been drawn without a single error. I settled back into my chair at the wooden drafting table and picked up my pen. I was an old man living a quiet, invisible life, and I had never been more formidable. I have carried this story for a long time. It was not easy to live, and it is not easy to tell. But I believe the telling of it matters because somewhere out there, someone is sitting in a similar silence, wondering if what they are experiencing is real, wondering if they have any recourse at all. I believe God does not let injustice run forever. The Lord's timing is rarely ours, but it is always precise. What this cost me was not money. It was the slow, grinding grief of loving a son who had decided that love was a resource to extract rather than a bond to honor. What it taught me is that age does not make you weak. Preparation makes you strong. And patience wielded with purpose is a more powerful instrument than any raised voice. If there are father stories like mine in your life, or in the life of someone you care about, I want you to hold on to these lessons. Document everything from the very beginning. A record kept quietly today becomes the foundation of justice tomorrow. Never confuse biological loyalty with earned trust. Blood is the starting point, not the guarantee. If someone is pressuring you to sign something, slow down. The urgency they manufacture is almost always designed to override your judgment. And when family justice finally arrives, and it can arrive, I am proof of it. It does not come from anger. It comes from evidence, from preparation, and from the refusal to be made invisible. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what you took from it. And if you have not yet subscribed to Alpha Dad Stories, now is the time. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you for being here with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself.